My name is Arrod. I'm what most people would call a tech nerd. I live alone in a small rented apartment on the edge of the city. The TV in my living room was playing some news about a rare astronomical event, 9 planets lining up, but I didn't care. I was busy with my work. I had a screwdriver in my hand, a cigarette hanging from my lips, ash falling like snow. I was staring at a small circuit board, trying to figure it out. Then the feeling hit me, that spark of inspiration. I grabbed my screwdriver and my hands moved fast, like a surgeon's. In moments, I was done. My buddy Fatty poked his head through the door. He wanted to know if I could copy the phone. I told him it was finished. He was thrilled. I had taken a cheap phone and made it look and work like an expensive, brand phone. That's what I do. I'm a knockoff king. Fatty's rich, but he's too cheap to buy the real thing. He just wants to impress girls. Fatty offered me a job at his dad's company again. I told him to get lost. I don't work under anyone, especially not him. Then he mentioned his ex-girlfriend, Yuan. I tried to sound casual, but the truth is, my heart ached. I had fallen for her the moment I saw her. Long hair, white dress, beautiful, but I could never say a word to her. My fingers are more skilled than my mouth. After Fatty left, I tried reading my favorite book about ancient craftsmanship, but I couldn't focus. I pulled out a special watch I had modified with a hidden camera and data cable. I plugged it into my dusty computer, and Yuan's image appeared on screen. I had secretly recorded her that day. We all had dinner together. Pathetic, I know. Then the weather turned ugly. Dark clouds, wild wind, lightning everywhere. I suddenly remembered. I had left a signal receiver on the roof for a client. I ran up in my flip-flops to save it. I grabbed the antenna just as a bolt of lightning struck it directly. The last thing I heard was someone screaming that a person got struck by lightning. My last thought was bitter. They say you shouldn't covet your friend's girl, and now heaven itself had punished me. When I woke up, everything was wrong. My head was splitting. I was lying on dry straw. My voice sounded strange. I stumbled through a dark room, bumping into rough wooden furniture, and pushed open a heavy wooden door. Sunlight hit my face. When my eyes adjusted, I couldn't believe what I saw. Green fields stretched everywhere. A muddy path wound past me. A clear stream flowed nearby. There was a windmill by a stone bridge, the kind you only see in Holland. People dressed in old European clothes were herding sheep and laughing. Dogs ran out from a forest, followed by men on horses with servants chasing behind them. I had no idea where I was or what had happened to me. I sat at a rough wooden table and caught my reflection in a silver-plated plate. The face staring back wasn't mine. It was a young European boy with a high nose, blue eyes, and golden fuzz growing on his upper lip. I was maybe 14 or 15, just starting to grow up, even though back in my real life I was already an adult. A woman's voice called from behind me, speaking something like German. She asked why I wasn't eating her smoked meat. I was confused and asked where I was. She gently touched my head and called me, poor little Arrod, saying I had fallen off a horse. So that was my name here, Arrod. Then the door slammed open. A big, muscular young man stomped in and grabbed a ham off the table. This was Eve, my older brother in this life. He was loud and rude, stuffing his face and mocking me for being thin and eating like a girl. The old Arrod would have kept his head down, but I'm not him. I shot back that at least I don't eat like a pig. Eve nearly exploded. Our mother had to step between us. That's when it hit me. I had actually traveled through time. When the lightning struck my antenna back in the modern world, it destroyed my old body and somehow sent my soul through the European TV signal into this medieval boy's body. Then a little girl tugged at my sleeve. She was about 5 or 6, with golden hair and big blue eyes. My little sister, Lena. She was adorable, but she looked at me with confusion. Then she started crying and said, "Brother Arrod is gone. He's gone." My blood ran cold. Children can sense things adults can't. If these people took her words seriously, they might burn me as a witch. I had to act fast. I grabbed a linen napkin from the table and quickly folded it into a little mouse shape, making it move between my fingers like it was alive. Lena stopped crying instantly, her eyes glued to the toy. Our mother was amazed I could do that. I told her I'd always known how. I just never showed anyone. Lena took the little mouse happily and forgot all about her worries. Over the next week, I learned about my new life. My father was Sir Wendell, a middle-aged knight with a crippled left hand, an old war wound from fighting for the previous duke. As a reward, The Duke of Mason's father had given him this village called Black Swamp. It got its name from a swamp on the east side that oozed foul-smelling black liquid. The peasants believed it came from hell. Our family lived in a two-story house made of mud and wood. My mother, Lady Eva, was proud of her few pottery jars and silver-plated plates displayed on a wooden shelf. It looked pitiful to me, but in this era, even small nobles showed off like this. One evening at dinner, my father spoke in his usual commanding tone. He said I was nearly a man and should become Eve's squire. Eve sneered and said he didn't want such a weak squire. But father overruled him. He said no one is more trustworthy than your own brother, and that my staff fighting was decent enough to guard Eve's back. Mother froze. She asked if there was going to be war. Father said the Duke of Mason was ordering his vassals to prepare for battle over a border dispute with the Duke of Saxony. He said it casually, like it was nothing. Eve leaned in and whispered about a rumor that the Duke had poisoned his own father with wild boar meat. Father shut him down immediately, reminding him that we were sworn knights, not gossiping peasants. I kept quiet. I knew my place as the second son, obey and follow. I looked down at the bowl of thick, tasteless porridge in front of me. Even nobles didn't eat meat every day here. I told myself that whatever brought me here, this was my life now. I had to forget who I used to be and live as Arrod. At least I was born a noble. After seeing how the medieval peasants lived, I figured things could be much worse. I walked through my father's village, taking in everything around me. My new body was tall and lean with good muscles. Village girls blushed when I passed by. I looked healthier than the peasants and carried myself differently, more like a gentleman than a rough medieval noble. The villagers noticed the change. They stared at me, crossed themselves, and turned away. The old Arrod used to play in the mud with their children, cursing and spitting. Now I seemed like a stranger to them. The village itself was miserable. Most buildings were crooked straw huts. Some were just holes dug in the ground with straw roofs on top. The peasants wore rags and scratched at fleas. Their hair was wild like weeds. Then I heard hooves pounding on the muddy road. Eve came galloping toward me on a brown horse, reckless as always, smashing through a farmer's fence without a care. I jumped aside and stepped right into a puddle, my leather shoes filled with dirty water. I called him a road menace, but the joke went over his head. He tossed me a long sword, nearly 2 meters, with a cracked leather grip and rust spots everywhere. It looked like it had been broken and welded back together. He told me that if father insisted I be his squire, he wanted to test what I could do. I followed him to a small forest outside the village. The morning air was fresh and cool. Holding that rusty sword, even as bad as it was, stirred something in me. Every man dreams of holding a real sword at least once. I swung it around a bit, but I had no real technique, just a nerd playing with a weapon. Eve took off his linen cloak, drew his own sword from a fine leather scabbard, and the difference was obvious. His blade was bright, straight, and sharp. Mine was a rusty piece of junk. I told him it wasn't fair. He laughed and said beggars can't be choosers, then waved me forward. I attacked first, lunging at him like a leopard. He wasn't surprised. The old Arrod always charged head-on after being provoked. Our swords clashed, and I felt his terrifying strength pushing me back. But this body was better than I expected. Years of training had given it speed, reflexes, and decent power. The old Arrod's problem was never physical, it was psychological. He feared his older brother too deeply to fight properly. But I don't have that fear. I changed tactics. Instead of meeting him head-on, I struck from the sides, used footwork to dodge his heavy swings. Eve grew confused. This wasn't his clumsy little brother. His attacks became wilder, angrier. Soon his eyes went mad with rage. He raised his sharp sword overhead like he genuinely wanted to gut me. That's when I made a very practical decision. I turned and ran. No hesitation. No shame. Knight's honor means nothing to me. I'd rather be alive than proud. Eve screamed behind me, calling me a coward and a disgrace to the Wendell family. He chased me through the forest, but his huge body crashed through branches like a bear in a china shop. I darted between thick fir trees covered in green moss, using every trunk as cover. The canopy above was so dense it blocked out the sky. After a while, I stopped behind a large tree to catch my breath. His shouting was getting closer. Running had actually made me angry rather than scared. I may be a nerd, but I'm a tough, independent nerd who built a life on my own. When backed into a corner, I fight back. I stuck my sword in the ground, rubbed my hands together the way I always do when I'm thinking, and started scanning my surroundings. I needed to build a trap. The question was, with what? Eve's voice was getting louder. I had to think fast. I didn't have much to work with in the forest, but I found enough. I cut a branch with my sword, grabbed a piece of dried vine, picked up some smooth stones from a stream, and got to work. I tied the stones to the ends of the vine to make a throwing weapon, like a bola. Eve came crashing through the trees, sword in hand. When he stopped to kill a badger that jumped out of a bush, I made my move. I threw the vine from behind a tree. It wrapped around his body and arms before he knew what hit him. Then I charged at him with my sharpened branch and struck him hard in the chest, right in the center. He doubled over and went pale, but the big oaf was tough. He grunted and started ripping the vine apart. Before things got worse, our father's voice cut through the forest. Sir Wendell had ridden out after villagers told him we were fighting. Eve kicked me to the ground and pointed his sword at my chest, but I didn't show any fear. Father rode his horse between us and told Eve to stop. Eve stormed off, swearing he'd kill me someday. Father looked at me with a curious expression. He said he had once planned to send me to my uncle's monastery, but now he was glad he hadn't. Then he rode away without another word. I spat dirt from my mouth and cursed. I hadn't asked to come to this time. I was filthy, hadn't bathed in a week. Bathing here is a whole project. The weather is too cold for rivers, so you need to burn a mountain of firewood to heat water, find a horse trough big enough to sit in, and seal all the windows shut. Peasants can't afford the firewood. Most nobles are too lazy to bother. So everyone stinks. I almost fainted from the smell when I first arrived, though by now I'm probably just as bad. I missed my tiny, messy apartment more than I ever thought possible, especially that cold shower head in my cramped bathroom. Then the family got a bigger problem. The Duke of Mason's dispute with the Duke of Saxony turned into a real conflict. After arguing at the Imperial Assembly, the Duke ordered all his vassals to prepare for war. The message reached our village. Father was commanded to bring his equipment, his horse, and 10 armed servants to the Duke's territory. That night, I couldn't sleep. Through the thin floorboards, I heard my parents talking. Father said he would take Eve to war. He had already spent a lot of money on Eve's knighthood training, and a good battle could earn the Duke's favor and enough loot to cover the family's debts. The harvest festival was coming too. They needed food and drink to host the peasants who worked their land. That was a lord's duty. Mother asked about me. Father sighed and said no. I was too young, and he had no spare equipment to give me. He couldn't even afford a shield for me. Mother kissed his cheek and quietly decided she would sell some of her pottery. A merchant from the city had admired a few pieces last time he visited. I pulled my eye away from the crack in the floor and lay back on my straw bed, itching from the rough stalks. These Germanic parents I never asked for clearly loved their family and were doing everything they could to hold things together in this hard world. The next morning, little Lena's crying woke everyone as usual. Eve went straight to the stable to wash down his horse. I helped Mother light the fire and cook porridge in the old pot. Father was in the armory, a stone room, the only solid building we had, digging through rusty leather armor, a warped bow with loose strings, and a dusty shield full of chips and dents. He shook his head at the sorry state of it all. I went to call him for breakfast and found him struggling with a shield that bore our family crest. The leather strap on the back had snapped, chewed through by mice, and the shield crashed to the floor. He kicked it away in frustration, cursing about having to pay a blacksmith for repairs. But I picked it up. The moment I saw the broken part, something clicked inside me. It was an iron-covered wooden shield with a simple leather strap nailed to the back. The original design was crude, just a strap hammered in place, stiff and easy to break. I realized I could cut the leather differently, make an adjustable loop with a buckle so the length could be changed freely. The original strap was long enough to work with. I dropped to the floor, grabbed a small dagger, and started cutting the leather. Father stood there staring at me with his mouth wide open. Father couldn't believe what I did with the shield. I had rewoven the leather strap into a shape that fit a human grip perfectly, added a triangle structure so it wouldn't slide on the arm, and put in 2 small iron rings so the strap could be adjusted for different people. He strapped it on and swung it around. It was lighter and easier to use than before. He told me he never knew I had this talent. But I barely heard him. I was already lost in the weapons around me. The armory was like a treasure chest to me. Old Roman javelin heads, Viking battle axes, medieval spears and lances, weapons collected over generations, all dusty and broken. This was exactly what I needed. Back in my old life, I took apart every gadget I could find. Now I had cold weapons to play with, and I threw myself into fixing them like a madman. I spent every day in that stone room, hammering and tinkering from morning until I forgot to eat. Mother worried I was losing my mind. She even bought a white candle from a traveling merchant and went to pray at the village shrine. Eve complained the noise kept him from sleeping and threatened to drag me out like a puppy. But Father told them to leave me alone. Maybe I had a hidden gift. Father had his own worries. He sat at the table writing on expensive parchment with a quill pen, then sealed it with candle wax and stamped it with his ring. It was a loan agreement. He was borrowing money from a Jewish moneylender to buy me equipment. He had decided to bring me to war too. Mother protested. She said someone should stay home to protect the family. Father told her I would only serve as support, holding horses, carrying weapons, managing servants. I wouldn't fight. Mother leaned against him and whispered a prayer. I didn't know any of this. I was happily finishing a bow I had straightened and repaired. If I could find you wood, I was confident I could build a proper English longbow. When I finally got hungry and went inside for lunch, Father told me I was going to war. I nearly choked to death on a mouthful of apple. Life in the village had been peaceful. Father's reputation kept even bandits away, though I privately thought it was more because we were too poor to rob. I stammered that I couldn't fight. Father didn't even look up. He said I would just handle supplies and servants. I thought about it. This was a dark, violent era. I couldn't hide forever. Maybe seeing a real war would teach me something useful. The days that followed were filled with boring, exhausting preparation. I had to clean and organize all of Eve's weapons, lance, javelin, bow, shield, and load them onto a wooden cart pulled by a pack horse. Mother prepared our food, dried apples, berries, sausages, and bread so hard it could break teeth. Then Father brought me my horse. It was a short, shaggy, dirty gray creature with hair hanging over its eyes and a limp in its left back leg. I looked at Eve sitting tall on his beautiful warhorse, then looked at my sad little beast. This is a horse? I asked. Father said that even as a squire, I was still a noble and couldn't walk on foot like a common servant. Then he handed me my weapon, a crooked spear made from fresh jujube wood, still green, clearly thrown together in a hurry. At least the spearhead was iron. Can I at least get a straight one? I muttered, knowing it was pointless to argue. Eve burst out laughing and called me the hairy monster knight. Ever since I beat him in the forest, Father had forbidden him from attacking me physically. So instead, Eve mocked me at every chance in front of everyone. I let his words blow past me like wind. I looked at the 12 farmers standing before us, our so-called soldiers. Some were toothless old men, others were clueless young boys. They stood barefoot in the cold wind, sniffling, wearing rags and smelly felt hats. I couldn't believe these were the armed light infantry my father had promised the Duke. I told Father they didn't even have weapons. He nodded and asked how many spears we had. I said 5. That's all I could repair from our sorry armory. Father frowned. He was already deep in debt and couldn't spend more. Eve rode forward on his tall horse, scaring the farmers like startled deer. He ordered anyone with combat experience to step to the front. 6 men came forward, 5 tough-looking men and 1 gray-haired old man. Father recognized them as veterans who had fought with him before. Eve told me to give the spears to these 6, minus the old man, and send the rest home to grab pitchforks and sticks. I asked why the old man was excluded. Father leaned down and whispered that his name was Jodo, known as Coward Jodo. He had fought in nearly every battle but always came out without a scratch, because he disappeared whenever the fighting got fierce. Yet strangely, Jodo had begged to join this campaign. I couldn't understand why a coward would want to go to war. It was a puzzle I couldn't solve. After the muster, Father was in a good mood and took me to the village tavern. It was a rickety wooden shack with a door made of old planks that never closed properly. Inside it was packed and hot. Fat barmaids squeezed between tables while men grabbed at them and laughed. It was crude and loud, a world of rough men and bad jokes. A crowd was gathered around a table where 2 men were arm wrestling. On the left was Eve. His opponent was a bald, muscular man wearing leather armor with a sword at his hip. They were locked in a dead heat, faces red, arm muscles bulging. Father was surprised. Nobody in our territory had ever matched Eve in strength. Then I noticed something. The bald man cursed in a foreign tongue. I recognized it immediately, English. This man was from England. I couldn't figure out how an Englishman ended up this deep inside the Holy Roman Empire. Eve won the match. The crowd cheered. Then Eve demanded payment for the bet. The bald man slumped in his chair and said he had no money. The tavern went silent. Everyone knew Eve's temper. Eve's eyes narrowed. His hand moved toward his sword. The Englishman tensed up, ready to fight. Blood was about to spill. I stepped between them. Eve cursed at me and told me to get out of the way, or he'd hurt me too. But I knew he wouldn't. Father was watching from nearby. I turned to the Englishman and asked him to explain. Through broken German and wild hand gestures, he told us his story. He had been traveling with a merchant caravan when bandits attacked. He barely escaped with his life and had almost no money left, just enough for a few cheap beers. He had been winning arm wrestling bets to earn some coins until he ran into Eve. I didn't really have the power to stop a fight between Eve and the Englishman, but both of them were secretly looking for a way out. Eve couldn't back down in front of his own people, and the mercenary was already eyeing escape routes. My stepping in gave them both a chance to cool off. I turned to the Englishman and acknowledged his bad luck, but told him a debt was still a debt. Then I turned to Eve and appealed to his pride. As the heir to this land and a noble German, he shouldn't be too harsh on a guest from far away. I suggested the Englishman pay his debt another way. Eve was interested. The mercenary nodded eagerly. I proposed he join our family's army and serve Eve for 1 year. Eve scoffed. He said he didn't need a man who fought for money. But Father stepped out of the crowd and told Eve to reconsider. Eve gave in. The mercenary's name was Marcus. He was skilled with swords and long-handled hook axes. I welcomed him warmly. Coming from the 21st century, I had no sense of class hierarchy. I only cared that this man was as strong as Eve and could be useful to us. Father immediately put Marcus in charge of training our farmer soldiers. Marcus threw himself into the job, but not the way anyone expected. Instead of teaching formations, he tied stones to the farmers' legs and made them run until they dropped. Anyone who slowed down got smacked with a wooden stick. Within days, the farmers were more miserable than before. They complained to Father that the crazy Englishman was trying to kill them. Eve stormed up to Father, furious, demanding Marcus be stopped. Father called Marcus over and asked why he wasn't teaching proper battle formations. Marcus explained in his broken German that these farmers were too weak and unskilled to stand in a real fight. If they faced experienced warriors head-on, they'd be slaughtered. Since he couldn't teach them combat skills in a few days, it was better to teach them how to survive, which meant running fast. Eve turned red as a lobster and screamed that Marcus was training our men to run away even better. Father frowned too, but I saw the logic in what Marcus was saying. I spoke up. I told Father to look at it differently. Our family was the lowest-ranking vassal the Duke had. We had no heavy cavalry, not even proper medium infantry. We couldn't change the outcome of a real battle anyway. So why not train these farmers as skirmishers? Light, mobile troops who harassed the enemy from a distance? That way we could help the Duke while keeping our own men alive. Father had never heard of this idea. I crouched down and used small stones on the ground to show two armies. One side was packed in a tight square formation, slow-moving but powerful up close. The other side was spread out and loose. I explained that a tight formation can't do anything if you don't get close to it. The key was to use ranged weapons and stay out of reach. Eve sneered and asked what ranged weapons. We only had 2 bows and barely any arrows. Training farmers to shoot would take years. I said we'd use slingshots. Everyone stared at me blankly. The word didn't even exist in their language. I had to explain it was like a sling for throwing stones, but more powerful. If I could find the right materials, I could make effective ones. Father stroked his chin, thinking it over. Fewer dead farmers meant more workers for his land. He was starting to like the idea. Eve pushed forward and dropped a big rock in the middle of my scattered stone. Soldiers. He growled that enemy cavalry would smash right through skirmishers. I agreed. That's why I proposed splitting our force into 3 squads of 4, led by Father, Eve, and me. If one squad got hit, the other 2 could support it. Father nodded. He liked the flexibility. It would also make it harder for the farmers to sneak away during the chaos of battle. Back in my old life, every boy played with slingshots. I was especially good at making them. My designs made other kids jealous. Now I had to build them again, but without rubber. In the Middle Ages, Nobody knew what rubber was. I spent days figuring out how to use leather strips instead and burned through most of our family's leather supply. In the end, I managed to make 12 slingshots from elderberry wood. Father asked me to demonstrate. I placed a stone in the leather pouch, aimed at a scarecrow about 100 paces away, pulled back, and released. The stone flew wide and hit a tree branch far behind the target, knocking leaves down. My face went red. The weapon maker who couldn't hit the target, embarrassing. But Father's eyes lit up. The stone had traveled over 200 paces with serious force. Even missing the target, he could see what this weapon could do to a man. I tried again, and this time hit the scarecrow square in the face. The stone buried itself in the straw head, and the whole body shook from the impact. Marcus the Englishman clapped. As a mercenary, he immediately saw the advantage. Slingshots were easy to learn, and the ammunition was free stones lying everywhere. Father was pleased too. A force with ranged attack ability would look better when reporting to the Duke. He had always been frustrated that our family was too small and poorly connected to gain entry to the Duke's court. I was surprised how open Father was to new ideas. I had assumed medieval nobles were stubborn and only trusted their lances. But I realized that was only true for powerful nobles who wanted to protect their advantage. Heavy cavalry supremacy. Small nobles like Father were different. They were always looking for any edge to improve their family's position. Encouraged, I proposed another weapon, a billhook, basically a farming sickle tied to a long stick. The English used them to fight cavalry. They were simple, made from tools the farmers already owned, cost almost nothing to produce, and were effective against horsemen. Father's patience ran out. He waved me off. He had fought his whole life and never heard of peasants with farm tools beating cavalry. Eve mocked me after Father left. A kid who hasn't grown hair yet thinks he can fight knights. That stung. I realized this wasn't my army. No matter how advanced my knowledge was, nobody would listen to a second son with no battle experience and no status. I stomped off to the river, angry, and started throwing stones into the water. Hey, who's throwing things? Are you blind? A thin figure jumped up from the tall grass by the riverbank. It was a girl in a worn linen dress, faded gray from washing, but very clean. She was skinny with blue eyes, golden messy hair, and an angry little face, fists on her hips, cheeks puffed out. Then she recognized me and laughed. She said her name was Layla, daughter of Jodo, coward Jodo. She reminded me that she had brought honey to our house back in May. She was a beekeeper. I pretended to remember, since that was before I arrived in this body. She tilted her head and said I seemed different somehow. I quickly changed the subject and asked what she was doing by the river. She brightened up and said she was looking for bees. They were her only friends, but there were fewer of them now because the weather was getting colder. I asked why she needed honey. She became shy and timid, looking at me with scared eyes like a little deer. She whispered that her father Jodo had a terrible cough, and she wanted honey to help him. She begged me not to tell Sir Wendell. I told her she was smart. Honey really does help with coughs. Then I mentioned her father's nickname. Instantly, the shy girl exploded. Her face turned red and she shouted that her father was no coward. He was a great warrior. I was completely caught off guard by the sudden change. Layla's outburst left us both awkward and silent. I felt bad for insulting her father to her face. But then I thought, I should help this girl. So I turned and ran back toward home. Our family's house sat on a small hill outside the village. It was the only building made of wood and stone, with a watchtower that let you see the whole territory, though the tower roof was rotting and leaked when it rained. Inside, Mother asked what I was looking for as I dug through everything. I told her I needed some honey for a sick friend. She laughed and said I'd never find it on my own. She had hidden it in the storage room. She brought me a small jar of dark clay and made me promise to bring the jar back. While waiting, I folded a little rabbit from a napkin and set it in front of my sister Lena, who was eating a sticky ball of malted wheat, her favorite treat. Looking at her chewing that bland paste, I felt sorry for her. Kids in my old world had no idea how lucky they were. I promised myself that if things ever got better, I'd find a way to make her something like fried chicken wings. I ran back to the river, but Layla was already gone. The sky was getting dark. I decided to walk into the village to find her house. The village was a circle of about 30 huts around a well. Snotty-nosed children played in the mud. Women sat outside mending clothes in the last daylight. When they saw me, everyone froze. Children followed me, staring at the honey jar and drooling. Nobles never walked into the village except to collect taxes. I politely asked where Layla lived. The women exchanged nervous glances. Some went inside and woke their husbands, who came out carrying sticks and pitchforks, suspicious. When they saw it was just me alone, they relaxed a little. A tall, thin old farmer silently pointed toward the edge of the village, toward the swamp. I thanked him with a small bow. This caused a stir. A noble bowing to a peasant was unheard of. The older farmers tapped their foreheads, telling each other I must have gone crazy from my fall. I followed the path toward the black swamp. The air turned foul. Thick black liquid bubbled up from the ground with a terrible stench. I couldn't understand why anyone would live here. Being pushed this far from the village meant being cut off from the community, which in this era was almost a death sentence. Then I saw it. A shack so crooked it looked ready to collapse. Thick logs were propped against all four sides to keep it standing. A few sticks served as a clothesline nearby. Coughing came from inside. The felt curtain over the door pushed open and Layla stepped out carrying a basket of green leaves. She looked up, saw me, and jumped back in shock. The basket fell and leaves scattered everywhere. I held up the honey jar and told her I brought what she needed for her father. But instead of being grateful, she backed away. Her face turned cold and suspicious. She told me to take the honey and leave. She had nothing to give me in return. I was confused. She had just told me her father was sick and needed honey. Now she was refusing it. She looked at me with frightened eyes and begged me to leave them alone. She said they weren't worth my trouble and asked what I really wanted from her. Then it hit me. I looked at the miserable shack, her ragged dress, her thin arms. She thought I had some hidden motive, that a noble wouldn't help a poor girl for free. Of course she was suspicious. In her world, people like me only took from people like her. I had been so focused on getting the honey that I never considered how it would look. A young lord showing up uninvited at a defenseless girl's door with a gift. I stepped back, set the honey jar on the ground, and told Layla to mix it into boiled water for her father to drink. Then I turned to leave. I stopped and asked her to return the jar when it was empty. It belonged to my mother. I wished her father a quick recovery and walked away. What I didn't know was that I had just barely escaped death. Behind me, from inside the shack, a crossbow was pointed at my back, the bolt tipped with something dark and blue. It was coward Jodo holding it. But this wasn't the hunched, timid old man I'd seen before. His back was straight, his face hard and dangerous. Layla threw herself at his feet, begging him to stop, swearing I only wanted to help. Jodo lowered the weapon with a sigh and hid it away. He told Layla never to forget why they had been living in hiding in this remote village for decades. These two clearly had secrets far deeper than anyone in our family knew. Meanwhile, our preparations for war continued. Father decided the troops needed a proper blessing before marching, so he wrote to his brother-in-law, Hofhannes, the abbot of St. Fonso Monastery. This uncle was the most powerful person in Mother's family. He controlled a wealthy monastery with vast lands, and even the local count had no authority over him. The abbot agreed to come, but asked Father to prepare hospitality for his entourage. Father was torn, honored by such a prestigious visit, but worried about the cost. A week later, on a Sunday, the abbot arrived. I watched from the side as the procession entered our village. The peasants lined the path and knelt with their hats off. The abbot's group was enormous. More horses than our entire family owned, servants driving donkeys loaded with luggage, and church knights in chain mail guarding them. The abbot himself rode in an oak carriage that bounced on the terrible road like a ship in a storm. He stepped out, a tall, thin man with a shaved head ringed by brown hair, deep-set blue eyes, and gemstone rings on every finger, red, green, blue. He smiled warmly and embraced Mother and Father. Eve stood at the door, staring at the wealth on display. "When will I have that kind of status?" he muttered. I couldn't help but laugh. He snapped at me. I said it seemed strange that a servant of God lived richer than most nobles, more like a nouveau riche than a holy man. Eve lectured me about the three orders ordained by God: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. The abbot prayed on behalf of all people. We nobles fought for justice. Peasants served both. That was God's will, he said, and asked if I dared question it. I shut my mouth. Coming from another era, I knew these churchmen lived off the labor of others. But I had to be careful. Challenging religious ideas here could get me killed. The dinner that night was painful. Our family had scraped together everything we could, but it was pitiful. The stored apples were shriveled and dry. The abbot chewed politely and washed it down with malt beer, hiding his disappointment for his sister's sake. But his monks were openly unhappy. Most came from noble families and were used to lavish treatment wherever they went. Being served dried-up food in a rundown village house insulted them. The mood turned cold and silent. Father noticed and stood to raise a toast, thanking the holy brothers for honoring his humble home. The monks raised their cups politely. Then a young monk in a gray robe spoke up with a mocking tone. "O heavens, God is my witness. I have never seen such generous hospitality." He had a pale red birthmark on his right cheek that made him hard to miss. The abbot's brow twitched for just an instant before smoothing back to calm. He introduced the young man to us as Brother Robert from Perhalem. Everyone heard the insult in Brother Robert's words. Father kept his composure, but I could tell he was furious. He had given everything he could for this feast, and a guest was mocking him under his own roof, something deeply offensive in Germanic tradition. Uncle Hoff Hannes scolded Robert loudly, reminding him that men of God shouldn't be so concerned with luxury. Robert backed down. He had gotten what he wanted, to embarrass the abbot in front of everyone. It was clear that behind the monastery walls, Robert's powerful family was threatening Uncle Hoff's position. Uncle had come partly hoping our family could support him, but our poverty was disappointing. Father saw through all of it. He decided to shift the mood the only way a knight's family could, with a show of strength. He told Eve to grab his shield and sword. Eve snatched a pointed eagle shield and drew his blade. He leaped before the crowd and slashed the air with terrifying speed. The pampered monks flinched and exchanged nervous glances. Robert's face went pale, his hand trembling under his robe. Eve split a thick wooden block in half with one strike. The room fell dead silent. Then a voice came from the doorway. "Fighting alone is boring. Let me be your opponent." A knight in chain mail walked in. He was medium-built with neat golden hair and a trimmed beard. He bowed to Brother Robert, then placed his hand on his sword. Uncle Hoff introduced him as Woodrow, a squire knight from Robert's family who had won a sword championship in Cologne. He was studying at the monastery. Father wasn't about to let anyone shame our family on our own ground, and he trusted Eve's skill. He told Eve to accept the challenge. I watched nervously. The two warriors clashed. Woodrow fought with twin swords, a long blade for attack and a short one for defense. He moved with incredible speed, sometimes crossing both blades like scissors. Eve was pushed back, hiding behind his shield, absorbing blow after blow. I found myself worried for Eve, which surprised me. He had made my life miserable since I arrived. But something deep inside, maybe some trace of the original Arrod soul, made me care about my brother and my family's honor. Eve waited for an opening. When Woodrow's long sword came from above, Eve raised his shield to block and thrust upward from below. But Woodrow's short sword swept down and stopped the attack. Worse, Eve stepped on a puddle of water, slipped, and had to drop his shield to keep from falling. It crashed to the floor by the door. I glanced at Father. His face was tight and grim. Uncle Hoff's friendly smile had vanished completely. Then I felt warm hands on my shoulders. Mother stood behind me. She said quietly, "Don't worry. If he could lose that easily, he wouldn't deserve the Wendell name." Her voice was calm and sure. Something stirred in me. In my old life, my parents had split up chasing their own ambitions. I was raised by my grandparents. They were kind, but couldn't fill the hole my parents left. Now, in this strange new world, I was feeling the warmth of a real family for the first time. I lowered my head so no one would see the tears forming in my eyes. On the field, Eve seemed lighter without the shield. He gripped his sword with both hands like a two-handed blade, leaned back slightly, and raised it to eye level, pointing the tip straight at Woodrow. Mother whispered in my ear, "Here it comes." Father's expression relaxed. He picked up his cup and took a quiet sip. Eve roared the family motto, "For the honor of the family," and charged. He thrust his sword forward with tremendous force. Woodrow's eyes went wide. He brought both swords down from above in a desperate counterattack. Metal rang so loud people covered their ears. Eve turned his thrust into a sideways block, catching both blades on his sword. As Woodrow's weapons slid to the right, his body lurched forward from the momentum. In a flash, Eve flipped his sword and pressed the sharp edge of the crossguard against Woodrow's exposed neck. It happened so fast, it almost looked like Woodrow had willingly placed his own throat on Eve's blade. Mother and father whispered at the same moment. The cross-strike worked. Eve held his blade against Woodrow's neck, right on the artery. One small pull, and Woodrow would be dead. But the knight showed no fear at all, as if the sword were just a silk scarf. He praised Eve's technique with genuine admiration, calling it a masterful display worthy of the Wendell family's reputation. Brother Robert's lips turned blue. Woodrow was his family's best fighter, and losing him here would be devastating. Eve smiled and lowered his sword. He complimented Woodrow's twin blade style and said it was something he himself could never master. The room exhaled with relief. Woodrow offered Eve his long sword, a fine piece forged by a Milan craftsman, as a token of gratitude for sparing his life. Eve accepted it, then did something that surprised me. He turned and gave the sword to me. His manner was still arrogant, but the gesture was clear. He wanted me to carry on the family's fighting spirit. Uncle Hannes leaped to his feet, overjoyed, and proposed a toast. The mood transformed instantly. The monks relaxed and started chatting, examining Mother's pottery collection. The evening was saved. Then Father brought me forward and introduced me to the abbot. Uncle Hoff looked me up and down, clearly puzzled that someone so unlike the burly Eve could be from the same family. Father said I had a different kind of talent and told me to demonstrate. I was nervous. In my old life, I had never dealt with important people. But I saw Mother's encouraging eyes, Father's hopeful look, and even Eve glancing my way. An idea struck me. I bowed properly. Mother had drilled court manners into me, and told Uncle Hoff I had an invention that could improve his travel comfort. He leaned back with curiosity. I pointed out that his carriage was basically a wooden box on solid wooden wheels with no cushioning. Every bump on the road went straight into his body. I pulled a small spring from my pocket, a coiled piece of iron wire I had found in our armory, probably fallen from some old weapon. I explained that if we installed many of these under the carriage seat, they would absorb the shaking and make the ride smooth. Uncle Hoff squeezed the spring between his fingers, watched it bounce back, and looked doubtful. But his aching backside from the journey made him willing to try. He agreed to let me modify his carriage. I had originally planned to use the spring for a repeating crossbow, but impressing a powerful ally was more important right now. The next morning, I worked with Uncle Hoff's servants to take apart the carriage seat. I nailed springs one by one onto the bottom board, then placed the seat board back on top and secured everything with wooden panels. It wasn't perfect. A layer of thick wool on top would have been better, but it was far beyond anything this era had seen. Uncle Hoff took the carriage for a test ride down the village path. When he came back, his face was glowing. He grabbed Father in a bear hug and declared that, satisfied, wasn't strong enough a word. He called me a master craftsman. True to his word, Uncle Hoff performed a grand blessing ceremony for our troops. He brought his own precious ritual vessels and expensive incense. The monks chanted solemnly around an altar while the abbot sprinkled holy water over our kneeling soldiers. The farmers were deeply moved. They believed they had received God's own blessing, and that even if they died in battle, their souls would rise to heaven. That was exactly the effect Father had been hoping for. He smiled with satisfaction. But I noticed something dark. While everyone knelt in prayer, one man's face twisted with hatred. His eyes burned as he stared at Uncle Hoff on the altar. His hands trembled inside his sleeves. Someone in this crowd was hiding a dangerous secret. Our family banner flew at the front of the column, a standing lion holding a sword, its hind legs on two blue ropes. Father rode tall on his warhorse with Eve fully armed behind him. I sat on my shaggy little horse that walked with a limp like a dog. I stared at the banner and learned that the simple colors showed our ancient lineage. The lion represented a family of warriors, and the blue ropes stood for loyalty. I slowed down and dropped back to walk alongside the soldiers. I spotted old Jodo marching in the middle, head down. I rode up and asked if his cough was better. He said it was. I told him to come find me if he needed anything. The other soldiers stared at me like I was crazy. A noble being kind to a peasant was suspicious, not comforting. They stepped away from Jodo as if my attention might bring him trouble. Suddenly hoofbeats came from ahead. Our scout, a free farmer who used his plow horse as a mount, galloped back with urgent news. Two noble families were fighting a private war up ahead, facing off across the Danube River. If we tried to cross, we'd be mistaken for enemies. Father wasn't surprised. Nobles fought private wars all the time in this era. The scout described the two banners, one with blue and white checkered pattern, the other red with white waves. Eve blurted out that the blue and white checkers belonged to the Duke of Bavaria. Father corrected him. It was more likely Count Heinrich von Rodenheim of Upper Bayern, whose family used the same pattern and liked to call themselves the Little Duke of Bavaria. We left the troops behind and rode ahead to see for ourselves. Past a small forest, a wide river appeared with a wooden bridge spanning it. About 100 men stood on each side, waving weapons and shouting insults, but nobody was actually fighting. Two noblemen argued on the bridge itself while merchants, travelers, and townspeople gathered around watching the spectacle. Father asked a frustrated merchant what was happening. The man scratched his bald head and said the counts of Upper and Lower Bayern were fighting over who got to collect tolls on this bridge. One claimed his great-great-grandfather built it. The other waved a parchment document proving ownership. The first called the document a forgery he could buy a dozen of from any Jewish merchant. Finally, the fat count of Lower Bayern shouted, "Then let God decide." The crowd around us perked up with excitement. I asked what that meant. Eve explained they would each send their best warrior to fight a duel. The winner would prove God's justice was on his side. I was amazed. Where I came from, wars involved tens of thousands of soldiers. Here, 2 men could settle the whole thing. Father explained that duels were the preferred form of private war. Nobody wanted unnecessary casualties because dead peasants meant lost income for the Lord. He made sure Eve was listening to that lesson. Sure enough, the peasant soldiers on both sides leaned on their pitchforks looking bored. Only the armored knights prepared for action. 2 stepped onto the bridge, both wearing iron helmets and chainmail with plate armor on their shoulders. One carried a sword and pointed shield. The other wielded a massive 2-handed sword. They saluted, announced their names, and began. Metal rang across the water. To my untrained eye, it was just wild swinging, but I sensed there was more to it and asked Eve to explain. He was happy to show off his knowledge. He pointed out that one knight used a low guard, sword tip pointing at the ground, long edge down. Father called it the deceiver's stance. It looked like an easy opening for the opponent, but it was actually a trap. If the enemy attacked, the knight could snap the blade upward for a fast thrust. The other knight held a balanced guard called the plow stance, sword handle at the hip, tip aimed at the opponent, like the angle a farmer pushes a plow. It was steady and defensive. After their explanation, I watched again with new eyes. Every thrust, every block, every angle had purpose. One small mistake could open you to a deadly counterattack. European swordsmanship was far more technical than I had ever imagined from watching movies. The duel on the bridge ended when the Upper Bayern knight found an opening. He slashed across his opponent's unprotected hands, making the man lose his grip, then brought his sword crashing down on the man's head. The helmet saved his life, but the Lower Bayern side lost. The defeated knight would have to pay 50 silver coins in ransom, covered by his furious fat count. For Father and Eve it was nothing special, but for me it was incredible. Germanic swordsmanship was a perfect blend of raw power and careful technique. A few days into our march, I walked into Eve's tent one evening and asked him to teach me the sword. He stared at me in disbelief. I told him I was serious and would work hard. He refused. He said last time he tried to test me, I cheated with traps and vines, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. I apologized and told him he could punish me however he wanted, as long as he taught me. I regretted that offer quickly. Eve tied me to a tree and dumped buckets of freezing water over my head until I could barely breathe. I hoped Father would save me, but he strolled past, asked what happened, laughed, and said young men need hardship. Eve walked away cackling. It was old Jodo who finally cut me loose and helped me back to my tent, where I lay shivering under a wool blanket. At dawn, Eve ripped the blanket off me and dragged me into the cold morning air. He shoved a heavy wooden sword into my hands, heavier than a real blade. He said if I wanted to learn, training with a heavy practice sword would build the right habits. My heart leaped. He had agreed. I started imagining myself as some glowing sword master from a fantasy novel, but Eve's bark cut through my daydreaming. Listen, rookie, a swordsman must master footwork first. If your stance is shaky, you'll fall like a giant stuck in mud. He taught me the T-step, 1 foot forward, the other turned out at 45 degrees. When stepping forward, Your feet form a new T shape. Slightly bent knees lower your center of gravity between your legs, making attacks faster and easier. I threw myself into learning with everything I had. While I was consumed with swordplay, I had forgotten about my little spring invention, and it was about to cause trouble I never expected. After leaving our estate, Uncle Hofhannes didn't go straight back to his monastery. He stopped at a nearby iron mine owned by the monastery. A bald merchant named Jeff managed the operation, but Uncle Hof's informants had told him Jeff was stealing profits and abusing the workers. The abbot planned to end Jeff's contract once the mine had produced enough to rebuild monastery buildings destroyed by fire. Jeff was desperate. The mine had been making him fortunes, hundreds of times what he earned before. Losing it felt like cutting out his own flesh. His one-eyed bodyguard, a scarred killer, offered to murder the abbot. But Jeff knew that was suicide. Killing a powerful abbot would bring down the wrath of Rome and every noble in the region. No one would shelter him, and no amount of money was worth his life. Then a voice came from behind them. They say merchants will grab coins from Satan himself. Yet you're this timid? It was Brother Robert, the young monk with the birthmark who had insulted our family at dinner. He had come alone, without his honorable knight Woodrow, because this plan required someone dirtier. Robert reminded Jeff, who had gotten him the mining contract in the first place. Now that the abbot was taking it away, Robert asked what Jeff planned to do about it. Jeff stammered nervously. He had always known Robert and Uncle Hoff were rivals, but today Robert seemed different, darker, more dangerous. Robert said there was only one solution, the same one the bodyguard had suggested. Kill him. While I was busy learning swordplay from Eve during our march, I had no idea that my little spring invention had set something terrible in motion. After Uncle Hofhannes left our estate, he visited an iron mine owned by his monastery. A bald merchant named Jeff ran the operation, but the abbot knew Jeff was stealing profits and mistreating workers. He planned to end Jeff's contract. Jeff was desperate. The mine was making him a fortune. Robert, the monk with the birthmark, came to Jeff in secret. He reminded Jeff, who had gotten him the mining contract in the first place. Now that the abbot was taking it away, Robert proposed a solution. Kill Hofhannes and make it look like an accident. Jeff was terrified, but Robert had a plan. He said the abbot's own nephew, meaning me, had given them the perfect opportunity. The springs I had installed in the carriage. Uncle Hoff spent a night praying alone in a small stone chapel on the mountaintop, as tradition required of every abbot. The next morning he climbed into his carriage, exhausted, and ordered his people to head back to the monastery. Robert deliberately pushed the group to move faster, stretching the column until it fell apart. The servants couldn't keep up. The knights lost formation. On a sharp mountain bend next to a cliff, it happened. The rough road shook the carriage violently. The spring-loaded seat, my invention, came loose and flipped open. Uncle Hoff was thrown through the left door, which had been tampered with, and plunged off the cliff. Knight Woodrow rushed to the scene. The carriage door was gone. The seat was flipped over, springs exposed. It looked like a terrible accident. The bumpy road, the new contraption nobody understood, an unlucky turn. Robert stood behind Woodrow and said calmly, "This is God's will." They found Uncle Hoff's body at the bottom, broken in two. The monks sewed him back together with wool thread so he could be whole for Resurrection Day. But whispers spread. Why would God let an abbot die so horribly? Was God angry with him? With the monastery? Robert fanned those whispers into flames. He proclaimed loudly in the monastery corridors that God had punished Hofhannes for his arrogance, that he had tried to offer wise counsel, but the stubborn abbot never listened. More and more monks rallied behind his voice. When the monastery's Council of 10 met to elect a new abbot, Robert won by a large majority. He sat in the oak chair, took his solemn vows, and became the new leader of St. Fonso Monastery. That night, Jeff's one-eyed bodyguard slipped into the new abbot's chambers. He asked if Robert's wishes had been fulfilled. Robert said this was only the beginning. The bodyguard reminded him of their deal. After all, it was his people who had sabotaged the carriage. Robert snapped at him to watch his tone. He was speaking to the abbot of St. Fonso now. But after a pause, he confirmed the agreement. Jeff would keep running the iron mine. I knew none of this. I was somewhere on the road, swinging a heavy wooden sword, dreaming of becoming a swordsman, completely unaware that my innocent little invention had been turned into a murder weapon. and that the consequences would eventually find their way back to me. I had no idea what had happened to Uncle Hoff. Our march continued, and because we traveled under the Duke of Mason's banner, the Bayern Counts let us pass without trouble. After about a week, we reached the Duke's territory. His castle sat on a small plain, and he also held a province called Weimar, a name I recognized from my old life. Listening to Father describe these great nobles and their vast lands made my head spin, but Eve hung on every word. 2 whole provinces, dozens of vassals, a stone castle guarded by elite knights. Compared to our crumbling wooden house and empty treasury, it was another world entirely. As we rode toward the gathering point, armored knights kept passing us. They wore shining helmets and fine chain mail, their surcoats decorated with family crests, their lances sharp and polished. When they saw our ragged group, they laughed openly. These were knights from wealthy counties, some serving directly in the Duke's household. They had rich estates and city taxes to fund their equipment. Even the poor knights and common men-at-arms we saw were better equipped than us. Father shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Eve asked if the Duke would have a problem with our shabby appearance. Father mumbled that we just had to do our best. Eve muttered angrily that we should have raided a rich village on the way to stock up. Father scolded him sharply. We were honorable knights, not bandits. Later, when I asked Eve about it privately, he exploded. He said every knight around us had gotten their fine gear through raiding enemy lands, and Father was a stubborn fool for clinging to his honor while we looked like beggars. He had a point, though Father was right too. Raiding created blood feuds that lasted generations. It struck me that these supposedly noble and righteous knights were really just well-dressed robbers at heart. Maybe this was the cultural root of why Western powers would later plunder the whole world. While Eve sulked under a tree, I heard the clash of weapons and cheering from the camp center. Eve told me it was probably night sparring and said I should go watch on my own. He wasn't in the mood to teach today. I found a wooden fence encircling a makeshift arena. 2 knights in mixed chain and plate armor fought with great swords. Their helmets had decorative crests, one a unicorn, the other a white swan. Despite the heavy armor slowing them down, their footwork was flawless. I could now appreciate the technique after weeks of training. Then a group of arrogant French knights nearby started mocking the fight. They said sword duels were primitive, and only mounted lance combat was real warfare. Standing with them was Count Dedi von Wettin of Lausitz, the Duke's nephew, a man around 30 with silver-gray hair, a big nose, and small eyes. He smiled and flattered the Frenchman, saying he had invited them precisely because heavy cavalry was the king of battle. The French knight with the curly mustache declared that any swordsman on foot would die instantly against a lance charge. This enraged one of the dueling knights, Sir Aber. He stopped his match, planted his sword in the ground, and lifted his visor, revealing a strikingly handsome face with delicate features. He challenged the French knight directly, saying Germans only believed what they saw, not what they heard. The Frenchman asked what would satisfy him. Sir Aber proposed a duel, but with an incredible twist. The French knight could fight mounted with a lance. He would fight on foot with a sword. The crowd erupted. Foot against horse was wildly unfair. Everyone knew mounted combat had an overwhelming advantage. The French knight hesitated and asked Sir Aber to withdraw the challenge. Even Count Dedi told them to stop this pointless contest. But Sir Aber raised his voice and said this was about the collective honor of all Germanic warriors. If they couldn't face a French lance, how could Germans ever call themselves the greatest fighters in Europe? The German crowd roared in support. Count Dedi had no choice. Once warrior honor was invoked, he couldn't stop it. He whispered something to the French knight and stepped back. The arena was cleared and widened. The Frenchman mounted his warhorse and took a lance fitted with a blunted tip. Sir Aber stood at the other end, holding an unsharpened greatsword. This bizarre, uneven duel was about to begin. In the camp, nobles displayed their status through colorful banners. Squires flew long-tailed triangular flags, and once they earned a knighthood, the tails were cut off to make square banners. That's why full knights were called square banner knights. Both the French knight and Sir Aber had square flags behind them, meaning they were experienced, titled warriors. The French knight hesitated on his horse. He was far from home, and picking a real fight with a local German knight could bring revenge later. But backing down would stain his honor forever. worse than death for a knight known for bravery. He lowered his visor and raised his lance. Sir Eber stood calm and focused, gripping his greatsword with both hands. The French warhorse began to trot. Then at 3 lance lengths it burst into a full charge. The French knight aimed for Sir Eber's shoulder, not the head or chest, to avoid killing him. But that hesitation cost him. Sir Eber executed a beautiful turning counterstrike and deflected the lance completely. The crowd exploded in cheers. Count Dedi's face darkened. The French knight pulled up, his lance still intact, unbroken, which was actually humiliating for a charging knight. I watched from the crowd and didn't share everyone's optimism. From everything I knew about warfare, a mounted knight's charge was devastating. Speed, height, and momentum made them nearly unstoppable on open ground. The Frenchman charged again. This time there was no hesitation. He leaned forward, legs locked in the stirrups, lance straight as an arrow. It slammed into Sir Eber's chest plate with a tremendous crash. The lance head shattered into pieces. Sir Eber flew backward and hit the ground hard, his body carving a trench through the mud. His sword landed meters away. His face was white as paper. I ran over. His young squire was kneeling beside him, crying that his master had stopped breathing. I pressed my ear to Sir Eber's mouth. There was still faint breath. I checked his pupils, no dilation. He was in shock, not dead. A powerful blow had trapped air in his chest. I told the squire to unlock the chest plate. The poor kid was falling apart, sobbing that it was God's will and blaming himself. I grabbed his thin shoulders, shook him, and told him firmly that the knight was only unconscious but would truly die if we didn't act fast. That snapped him awake enough to help me pry off the dented breastplate. There was no time to remove the chain mail underneath. I folded my linen shoulder cloth into a square, placed it on Sir Eber's chest, raised my fist, and hammered down as hard as I could, again and again. "Stop! What are you doing?" Count Dedi shouted from behind me. But right then, Sir Eber coughed. Color returned to his face. His blue eyes flickered open. Before I could feel any relief, one of the Count's bodyguard knights grabbed me by the shoulder and threw me aside. I tumbled through the mud. By the time I stood up, soldiers had surrounded the Count and Sir Eber. I wondered who this knight really was to make the Count so worried. Perhaps a relative of the Duke himself. I dusted off and headed back to camp, where Father was shouting for me. The Duke's general, a tall, red-haired former Danish nobleman, was rallying the knights. A squad of Saxon cavalry had crossed into our territory, and the Duke ordered 5 lance units to ride out and drive them back. I asked Yves what a lance meant in military terms. He looked at me like I was stupid, but explained, a lance was 1 knight plus his squire and armed servants, at least 5 men total. 10 lances made a company. 5 or 10 companies made a regiment. "Stop asking questions and get ready," he said. "You're assigned to my lance." The Saxon Duke was said to be an aggressive warrior who hated waiting. When he learned the Duke of Mason was gathering forces, he sent his own knights across the border first, to scout for good battlefields and show off his strength. Our Duke wasn't going to sit still either. He ordered General Relf, a big red-haired Danish nobleman, to assemble a small strike force of knights to push the Saxons back. We rode out through dense forest. I carried Woodrow's fine sword at my waist and wore a leather armor jacket, stiff cowhide tanned with a foul-smelling process. It stank, but I couldn't complain. Most of the men around me only had linen shirts. I was on foot this time, serving as Yves' squire, carrying his heavy lance with a small blue triangular flag on top. Knights saved their energy before battle by letting their squires carry everything. When we cleared the forest, 2 light cavalry scouts reported to General Relf. Saxon soldiers were burning a village ahead. They could hear screaming and see black smoke. About 50 enemies, maybe 10 knights among them. Relf punched one scout off his horse for not getting better numbers, but the information worried him. We had fewer than 30 men. Yves kicked his horse forward and volunteered to lead a probing attack with just his lance unit. Relf's eyes narrowed. If someone was willing to draw out the enemy, he could observe their true strength from a safe distance. He agreed. I was panting behind Yves, hauling his lance on foot. I told him this seemed reckless. He laughed and said knights should take risks. Didn't I see how the general looked at us with new respect? I muttered that what I actually saw was pity in the other knight's eyes. We approached the burning village. Eve on horseback, me, and 4 armed servants. The Saxons spotted us immediately. Their leader was Baron Difoni, a distant relative of the Saxon duke. He was rich, with many estates, but had never actually fought in a real war. He had volunteered for this campaign because he was bored with peaceful manor life and craved the excitement of battle. When the village elders had tried to surrender peacefully, he had stabbed the old man with his sword and ordered his men to set the roofs on fire. This was his idea of war. When his scouts told him only 5 men were approaching, the Baron was confused. His knights debated whether it was a trap. They decided it wasn't worth their own effort. Our group looked too poor to yield any decent ransom. They argued over how many foot soldiers to send. The Baron split the difference and ordered 15 men-at-arms forward. Despite the Baron's inexperience, his soldiers were properly trained. They formed 2 neat columns with spears and pointed shields, marching toward us behind an old veteran sergeant calling cadence. They steadily closed the distance between us. I stood at Eve's left side, ready to hand him his lance. This was my first time facing real enemies, and my heart was pounding. The Baron's soldiers stopped about 100 paces away. Their formation was sloppy, nothing like the disciplined Roman legions I'd read about. These were just tribal warriors pretending to be an army. They started banging their spears against their shields and howling at us, trying to scare us into attacking first. Eve sneered and called them cowards building up their own courage. I realized why. These soldiers had no armor at all, while Eve sat on a tall warhorse in full chain mail and iron helmet. The psychological gap was enormous. Eve wanted to charge immediately, but I stopped him. I suggested I take our servants forward with slingshots to lure the enemy toward those 2 trees near the village entrance, where the flat ground would give Eve a perfect charging lane. He agreed and told me to draw them between the trees where he'd be waiting. I pulled out my slingshot and led our armed servants forward. My first stone hit the oldest sergeant square in the forehead. Blood poured down his face. I felt a small thrill, my first real strike in this era. Without helmets, these men were completely vulnerable to our stones. The sergeant's injury enraged his comrades. They forgot all caution and charged at us screaming, ignoring the wounded man's warnings that it was a trap. We retreated while firing, and the slingshots proved their worth. Stones kept striking unprotected bodies. The soldiers tried hiding behind their shields, which slowed them down. They were frustrated, taking hits they couldn't answer. Then I heard a scream behind me. One of our servants, a young man named Avery, had been hit in the foot by a thrown spear and fallen to the ground. The others kept running, too scared to look back. I didn't think. I shoved the slingshot into my belt, drew my sword, and ran toward Avery. An enemy soldier had already reached him and was trying to drive his spear through Avery's chest. Avery gripped the spear shaft with both hands, desperately holding it back, begging God to save him. I charged in using the oxguard stance Eve had taught me and slashed downward at the soldier's arms. My cut was shallow. I had misjudged the distance, but it was enough. The soldier grabbed his bleeding arm and stumbled back. Avery crawled behind me through the mud. The soldier recovered quickly. He leveled his spear at me, using its reach advantage. He crouched like a coiled spring and thrust at my chest, a move he'd practiced hundreds of times. But he forgot one important thing, my sword. I sidestepped the spear point, raised my blade high, and chopped down on the wooden shaft. Woodrow's cold-forged sword cut clean through the birch wood like it was nothing. The spear snapped in 2. The soldier stared at his broken weapon in horror. I recognized the forging technique from my old life. I'd seen hobbyists in an online weapons forum make swords exactly like this. It was the finest metalwork of this era. The soldier's face twisted with fear. I waved him off and told him to get lost. Then I turned my back, grabbed Avery, and started helping him toward our rally point. That was incredibly stupid of me. I came from a world with laws and police. In my old life, a beaten opponent walked away. But this was the Middle Ages. There were no rules on a battlefield. Only kill or be killed. I had turned my unprotected back to an enemy who had every reason to want me dead. Behind me, the soldier picked up the broken spear, the half with the iron point still attached, and charged straight at my exposed back. I heard the sound behind me and spun around. The soldier I had spared was already on top of me with the broken spear. There was no time to draw my sword. In that instant, death was closer than it had ever been. Then Avery, the wounded man I was trying to save, shoved me aside, and threw himself between us. The spear stabbed into Avery's shoulder. Something snapped inside me. I screamed, swung my sword from below, and slashed the soldier's throat in one clean motion. He touched his neck. A thin white line appeared, then blood erupted like a broken dam. He dropped to his knees and fell like a cut tree. I grabbed Avery. The broken spear had gone into his shoulder, painful and serious, but not immediately fatal. He told me to leave him and run. I told him to shut up. I had never abandoned anyone before. But carrying a wounded man slowed me too much. The enemy soldiers caught up and surrounded us. We stood back to back. I handed Avery a small meat-cutting knife and faced the spearman with my sword. This was it, our last stand. Then I heard hoofbeats and a savage war cry I recognized instantly. Eve. He came thundering in from behind the enemy, lance leveled, chain mail rattling. His lance punched clean through one soldier's chest, the body flying into the air from the impact. His warhorse trampled through the rest, scattering them like toys. Something took hold of me. I roared and charged into the broken formation, swinging my sword with everything I had. Cross strikes, drag cuts, alternating attacks. Everything Eve had taught me poured out. Blood soaked my leather armor. For the first time, I wasn't thinking like a man from the 21st century. I was a Germanic warrior of this age, and my sword was singing. The surviving soldiers broke and ran, dropping their weapons. Our servants chased them down, suddenly brave now that victory was certain. Back at the village, Baron Difoni was tearing his hair out in fury. 15 men beaten by 5, impossible. He ordered all his knights to mount up and ride out to crush us. But from the Treeline, General Relf had been watching everything. Our small victory had electrified his entire force. The knights' eyes burned with eagerness. Relf knew this was the moment. Morale wins battles more than numbers or weapons. He raised his fist and pointed toward the enemy. Forward. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. Chainmail sang. Lances dropped into charging position. The Mason Knights burst from the forest and slammed into the Baron's hastily formed hedgehog defense. The first wave of lances smashed through shields, sending soldiers flying. The second wave drove lances into bodies. It was devastating and terrible. A chunk of brain splattered onto Baron Difoni's face. He went white, stammering and screaming incoherently. Eve and I watched the charge from nearby, hearts pounding. Then Eve ripped off his helmet, threw it on the ground, and grinned at me with wild eyes. Come, brother, let's earn our glory. He reached down his hand. I smiled, grabbed it, and swung up onto his horse behind him. His lance was broken, so he drew his sword. We charged together on one horse into the enemy ranks, both of us swinging our blades and shouting. The Mason Knights saw us, 2 brothers sharing one horse, fighting side by side, and instead of laughing, they gave us room out of respect. The Saxon Knights fought hard but couldn't hold. The Mason charge was like a flood. Baron Difoni's men begged him to retreat. The Baron babbled nonsense about finding his cousin the Saxon Duke and killing everyone. His knights grabbed him and pulled him away from the battlefield. I didn't know how deep this war would eventually pull me. Right now, all I knew was the weight of my sword, my brother's back against mine, and the strange, terrifying, exhilarating truth that for the first time in either of my lives, I truly belonged somewhere. Baron Difoni fled with only 2 knights at his side, but I had spotted his square banner moving toward the rear. I remembered a tactic from a Japanese strategy game, spreading panic by shouting that the enemy commander was running away. The Saxon general is fleeing, I screamed at the top of my lungs. A quick-thinking Mason Knight picked it up and shouted the Baron's actual name. The Saxon soldiers looked back, saw the banner retreating, and their will to fight collapsed. Most threw down their weapons and ran. I stood up on the horse behind Eve, one hand on his shoulder, the other waving my sword, pointing toward the fleeing Baron and yelling for everyone to chase him. The Saxon retreat turned into a complete rout. The Baron's knights led him to a stream, hoping to cross it, but the current was too strong for men in heavy armor. They nearly drowned and had to stagger back to shore, soaking wet, exhausted, barely able to hold their swords. That's where Eve and I caught them. The Baron offered a deal. He said we should release him and he'd send ransom money later, swearing on his title before God. He even started pulling off his glove to give me his ruby ring as a pledge. I walked up pretending to accept, then grabbed his hand and yanked him off his horse. He crashed to the ground screaming. Eve charged forward and blocked the two Saxon knights before they could react. Then I sat on the Baron's chest and punched him in the face, over and over. One for killing the village elder. One for burning the village. One for wounding our men. One for being a terrible human being. He wailed and cried, his eyes swelling shut, blood running from his nose and mouth. In war, captured nobles were supposed to be treated with courtesy. I didn't care about that tradition. Eve told me to stop when I'd had enough so we could bring the Baron to General Relf alive. A living Baron was worth more money. I kicked the Baron's helmet one last time, wishing I had a brick like in the schoolyard fights of my old life. We rejoined the army at sunset. The Mason Knights had won the field. Losses were light. As Eve and I rode through the column, the knights cheered and called us the Twin Riders, two brothers fighting from one horse. The nickname spread through the whole camp. Eve puffed out his chest with pride. Even I couldn't help smiling. Father was waiting at the castle gates. He hugged us both. The story of our fight had already reached the Duke's court. Officials were asking General Relf about the Twin Riders. Father was overjoyed. It seemed like our family's fortunes might finally be turning around. I dragged the Baron forward on a rope. He was stripped down to his linen shirt and trousers, shivering in the cold wind. Father scolded me immediately. I had treated a nobleman disgracefully. The Baron made pitiful noises through his swollen face. Father apologized to him, explaining that I was only a squire without proper knight's training. We started discussing ransom terms. But before we could settle anything, soldiers wearing Count Dedi of Lausitz's colors marched up. The oldest one shoved a small money pouch at Father and reached for the Baron, saying the Count was taking custody of the prisoner. I drew my sword in one smooth motion and laid the blade across the soldier's arm. "Take your hand off him," I said quietly, "or I'll cut it off." Father's brow furrowed. He stepped forward and asked the soldiers to explain exactly what was going on. The news of our capture had traveled fast. Count Dedi of Lausitz wanted Baron Difoni for himself, as a bargaining chip with the Duke. He sent his household knights with a pathetic bag of coins to take the Baron from us. Father stood tall and declared to the gathering crowd that the Baron was our lawful prisoner. If the Count wanted him, he should follow proper knight's protocol and ask in person, not send thugs with pocket change like a common robbery. The watching knights roared in support. Count Dedi had long abused his position as the Duke's nephew, and everyone was sick of it. The household knights whispered among themselves. They decided that dying for their lord's orders was better than returning empty-handed. They drew their swords and advanced. I chose the plow stance and waited. The moment the first knight stepped into my range, I feinted a thrust at his arm. He raised his sword to block, but that was exactly what I wanted. My real target was the gap between his fingers and the sword grip. I dragged my blade across, and his sword clattered to the ground. One move, one disarm. Eve cheered. Father nodded with approval. The remaining knights froze, unsure what to do. Then a thundering voice came from behind them. "You useless fools. The Count knew you couldn't handle this." A man the size of a half-tower shoved the knights aside like kindergartners. Behind him came a tall, thin man with a ghostly pale face and a creepy giggle. And behind him waddled a short, fat man with a face like a pig, upturned nostrils, flapping ears, truly hideous. The crowd gasped. The Wild Boar Brothers, three infamous outlaws from the Potrelheim family, whose crest was a wild boar. Father explained quickly. Their family practiced dark, ancient customs from the Black Forest, including inbreeding, which explained their deformed appearances. They were wanted by the imperial court for extreme cruelty, but had found protection under some powerful lord, apparently Count Dedi. The pig-faced eldest, Grover, gave orders. The giant, Patsy, was sent against Eve. The thin one, Ogden, claimed me. The young handsome one, he said with a sick laugh. Grover himself would take on Father. Patsy charged Eve like a boulder rolling downhill, swinging a massive iron mace covered in barbed spikes. The weapon glowed dark red. Dried blood caked into every crevice. The smell of rotting blood filled the air. Eve blocked with his two-handed sword, but each hit from the mace sent painful vibrations through his hands. Ogden came at me silently. I barely noticed his thin blade appearing inches from my face. He had crept in without a sound, striking from nowhere. I knocked his sword away with my crossguard just in time and dropped into a defensive plow stance. This man was nothing like the soldiers I had fought earlier. He was a predator. Just when the fight was reaching a desperate point, hoofbeats thundered through the camp. Riders burst in, followed by dozens of armed soldiers with spears. General Relf's booming voice ordered everyone to stop. Beside him rode a nobleman in fine purple wool embroidered with the Duke of Mason's crest. His face was refined and strikingly handsome. I wiped sweat from my eyes, dodged one last slash from Ogden, and looked up at the newcomer. My jaw dropped. I knew this person. We had a connection from before. It was Sir Aber, the knight I had saved after the jousting match. When I looked up, I recognized the nobleman riding beside General Relf. It was Sir Aber, the knight I had saved after the jousting match. He wore fine purple wool embroidered with the Duke of Mason's crest. He winked at me, letting me know he remembered. Sir Aber demanded to know why there was fighting in camp when the Duke had forbidden private duels. Grover bowed and said they were following Count Dedi's orders to collect Baron Difoni. I stepped forward and pointed out they had tried to buy a nobleman for 12 silver coins, less than what Judas got for betraying Jesus. Even the Baron himself whimpered in agreement, insulted that he was valued so cheaply. Sir Aber told the Wild Boar brothers to leave immediately, blaming them for pocketing the Count's money, a convenient excuse that protected the Count's reputation while getting rid of the thugs. General Relf's soldiers raised their spears. Grover had no choice. The three brothers slunk away with the household knights. We all exhaled with relief. Those three were terrifying: Patsy's monstrous strength, Ogden's ghostly swordsmanship, and Grover, who hadn't even shown us what he could do. Sir Aber dismounted. A servant knelt so the knight could step on his hands, and entered our humble tent. Father welcomed him with deep respect. Now we knew who this man truly was: the eldest son of the Duke of Mason, future heir to one of the 7 elector houses of the Holy Roman Empire. His full name was Hermann von Aber. Sir Aber was direct. He had come for Baron Difoni, the same goal as Count Dedi, who happened to be his uncle. Father was torn. He wanted to repay Sir Aber for rescuing us, but we desperately needed the ransom money. He gritted his teeth and offered the Baron for 100 silver coins, a painfully low price. Eve and I both blurted out, "Father," at the same time. 100 coins was practically giving the Baron away for free. Sir Aber paused, looked around at our threadbare tent, and laughed. "I cannot accept that price," he said. My heart sank. Then he continued, "I will pay 1,500 silver coins. The Hermann family can afford it." Father's jaw dropped. Eve looked like he'd been struck by lightning. I felt dizzy. We had borrowed 300 coins for this entire campaign. Sir Aber was offering 5 times that amount. He explained, 1,000 coins was a fair ransom for the Baron. The extra 500 was a reward for me saving his life after the jousting accident. The Hermann family always repaid their debts. Father's eyes glistened when 2 servants carried in the chest and opened it. None of us had ever seen so much silver in our lives. The coins gleamed and clinked, and for a moment nobody could speak. After Sir Aber left, Father closed the chest and said we needed to plan carefully. Eve immediately shouted that we should buy proper weapons and armor so we wouldn't be the poorest lance unit on the battlefield. But I had a different idea. I suggested we invest most of the money in trade goods, buy merchandise here and sell it in other towns. That way our money would keep growing instead of disappearing in one spending spree. Eve scoffed and asked who among us knew anything about trading. I grinned and told him that actually I did. Back in my old life, I had run a small street stall during summer breaks, selling lighters and small goods. It wasn't much, but it was more business experience than anyone else in this family had. The Duke's castle sat on a plain surrounded by 3 villages that supplied food. Where people gathered, trade followed, and a lively market had sprung up outside the castle walls. I led my shaggy horse through crowds of nobles in bright clothes, merchants in fine round caps, and farmers selling eggs for pennies after paying their taxes. Colorful linen tents lined both sides of the open ground, and blacksmith shops hammered away inside sturdy wooden buildings. Father hadn't sided with me in the argument about investing. He agreed with Eve that buying weapons and armor came first, but he trusted me enough to let me explore the market afterward and maybe pick up some goods if I found a good deal. I wandered into a blacksmith shop and noticed right away that they were still using the old hot forging method, inferior to the cold forging technique I recognized from Woodrow's sword. As I watched, a loud argument broke out. A big bearded man wearing a guild leader's medallion was scolding a young blonde blacksmith named Uin for trying to quench a sword in water, something he claimed to have seen the Milanese do. The guild leader, Lambert, told Uin to stop chasing strange ideas and just work properly. Uin's father had been a master blacksmith who nearly became guild leader himself, but he ran off to Milan chasing the secret of superior sword-making. The Milanese guild kicked them out, and Lambert took the leadership. Now Uin was Lambert's apprentice, and Lambert had promised him his daughter Bonnie in marriage if he behaved. After Lambert left, I asked around and got the full story. Then I explored the shop. Most of the weapons were mediocre, but one helmet caught my eye. A kettle hat made of woven willow branches reinforced with iron strips in a cross pattern, covered in leather with iron rivets. It was light, tough, and gave full vision, perfect for light infantry. Far better than the heavy bucket helmets German knights loved, but that were nearly blind inside. Uin had made it, inspired by Milanese city militia designs, but improved with the iron reinforcement. He offered it for 5 silver coins, dirt cheap. The other blacksmiths tried to push their heavy iron helmets on me instead, but when I told them I was just a squire, not a knight, they lost interest and walked away. Nobody wastes time on a penniless squire. Uin led me to his home, a cramped room in a filthy tenement by the castle's sewage ditch. Inside, his elderly father sat hunched over a table covered in iron fragments, muttering to himself. He was tapping a piece of cold-forged sword with a small hammer, and it shattered. The old man was obsessed with replicating the Milanese cold forging technique, but couldn't figure out why his blades kept breaking. The longer he hammered them cold, the more brittle they became. Something stirred in me, a deep kinship. One craftsman recognizing another's torment. I knew that hunger for perfect technique. It lived in my bones from my old life. I stepped forward and told him the problem. He was hammering too long and at the wrong temperature. The metal shouldn't be too hot when cold forged. The old man said he had tried that. It made better swords than the standard method, but still nothing close to the Milanese quality. They had to be hiding something. I smiled. I knew exactly what the secret was. In my old life, I had been part of an online community of cold weapon enthusiasts. I had seen hobbyists replicate the exact process. I happened to know that secret, I said. The secret came from an ancient Chinese story I had read in my old life. The legendary swordsmiths Gan Jiang and Mo Yi discovered that adding certain substances to the forging process changed everything. Human blood worked because of its trace elements, but I wasn't going to suggest that. Plant sap and honey did the same thing. I told the old man, use honey or tree sap to cool the blade during cold forging. That's the Milanese secret. His eyes blazed with a strange light. He grabbed my arm so hard his bony fingers hurt, pressing his face close to mine. Uin panicked and tried to pull his father off me, afraid the old man would anger a sword-carrying noble. I waved it off. I understood perfectly. When someone has been trapped in a dead end for years and suddenly sees the exit, the joy is overwhelming. Then the old man fainted in my arms. I instinctively reached for my phone to call for help before remembering. Right, Middle Ages, no phones. Uin apologized repeatedly, explaining his father hadn't slept in days, running on pure obsession. Hearing the answer had released all the tension holding him up. That evening, Uin delivered 15 kettle helmets and 3 leather armors to our camp at a rock-bottom price. He said his father was already working on a sword using my technique, and if it succeeded, he would give it to me as thanks. Eve was impressed. He didn't know how I'd managed it, but admitted I was useful. Father came out of his tent and asked what I'd found at the market worth buying. I pointed at the mug of malt beer in Eve's hand. The market was flooded with beer. Merchants from all over the empire had rushed here expecting to sell to the gathered army, but there were too many sellers. Prices had crashed. Local merchants wouldn't touch the stuff. Eve said buying cheap beer nobody wanted was a terrible plan. I disagreed. I told Father that once the Duke marched us out, soldiers on the road would be desperate for drink. Everyone from knights to foot soldiers was addicted to beer. They could skip meals, but not their daily mug. We could buy barrels now for almost nothing and sell them to friendly troops during the march at huge profit. Father asked how I knew the Duke was about to move. I explained. Thousands of troops eating through the castle's grain stores would force even a rich family to send everyone away soon. Better to push us into enemy territory where we could forage off Saxon lands. Father nodded. He was glad the family finally had someone with a head for strategy. Days later, while exploring the market, Sir Aber and General Relf were strolling through the blacksmith stalls. Aber spotted a young smith, Ewan, holding a plain-looking sword. The other smiths were mocking him. Then Ewan raised the blade and chopped a hanging iron sickle clean in half. The smiths gasped. That was impossible with ordinary German steel. Sir Aber's eyes locked onto the sword. He demanded to know the price. Ewan clutched the blade to his chest and said it already had an owner. It was the sword his father had forged using my honey-quenching secret, meant as a gift for me. Sir Aber's face went pale. He asked who had bought it. I wasn't surprised when Ewan showed up with the finished sword. His father had finally slept soundly for the first time in years after completing it. What did surprise me was Sir Aber walking right behind him, smiling like a child on Christmas morning. Ewan handed me the sword. It was simple, narrow blade, cross-shaped guard, no decoration, just a test piece. But when I ran my thumb along the edge, I could feel the difference. Cold forged with honey water cooling, it was far harder and more resilient than anything the hot forging method could produce. The blade gave off a strange, subtle gleam. While I was examining it, Sir Aber cleared his throat awkwardly. I assumed he had come to see father about military orders. But no, he was here for the sword. Ewan had already told him it belonged to someone, but the knight had insisted on finding out who. When he learned it was me, he came along hoping to negotiate. I looked at the sword in my hand, then at Sir Aber's desperate expression. To him, this was a priceless treasure. To me, it was less impressive than a kitchen knife from my old life. Where I came from, this was basic metallurgy. I understood something deeper, though. My family was small and weak. If I wanted us to survive and grow, I needed a powerful patron. There was no better candidate than the Duke's eldest son and heir. An old Chinese saying echoed in my mind. Give first, receive later. I pulled the sword from the dirt where I had casually stuck it, which nearly gave Sir Aber a heart attack, and handed it over. It's yours, I said. He couldn't believe it. He asked if I was serious. I told him it wasn't entirely free. I asked only that he mention the Wendell family's loyalty to the Duke sometime. We had served the Hermann family for generations, and it would mean everything if the Duke himself knew of our devotion. Sir Aber relaxed and laughed. Of course, that's nothing, he said, clutching the sword to his chest like a treasure. Then, just as he was leaving, he turned back with sudden excitement. The Duke was hosting a formal banquet tonight for his important vassals. Sir Aber would personally request that our family be invited. When I told father, he was stunned. Small nobles like us never entered the castle, let alone attended the Duke's banquet. Eve hooped and grabbed a horn cup of beer. Father stroked his beard and said it was probably the sword's doing. He had heard the Duke's heir was obsessed with weapons. Either way, we needed proper clothes. We went to the tailor shops at the market, where fine dyed linen was sold for noble garments. Germanic noblewomen wore round-necked dresses showing their white throats, with braided hair and decorative headbands, simpler than the tall pointed hats French ladies favored. Noble men wore rectangular cloaks pinned at one shoulder or fastened at the chest. The gossip among the ladies was that the Duke's own family wore silk from the East, priced by weight in gold. That made everyone gasp, except the woman sharing the gossip, who looked very pleased with herself for knowing. We bought the best clothes we could afford and prepared ourselves for the most important evening of our family's life. Night fell and the castle blazed with torches on 3 levels, glowing like a jewel against the dark countryside. Carriages packed the narrow gate as nobles arrived in their finest clothes, barons with their wives, countesses, even an archbishop. Heralds announced each name in booming voices. Our little group slipped in among them, painfully out of place. Our clothes were plain. We had only 2 or 3 servants, and their outfits were embarrassing. Eve gawked at the towering walls like a country boy seeing a city for the first time. I told him to calm down. Having lived in a world of skyscrapers, I wasn't impressed by walls you could climb with a ladder, though I did appreciate the cleverly narrow gate, designed to bottleneck any attacking force. When we finally reached the entrance, the court attendant blocked us. He looked at our modest clothes and unfamiliar crest and asked who we were. I explained we were invited by Sir Aber. Eve shoved forward impatiently, his huge frame scaring the attendant backward. 2 guards crossed their broad axe pole arms in front of Eve. I grabbed my brother's arm before things got worse. Then hoofbeats announced the arrival of Count Dedi of Lozitz, our nemesis. He rode in on a white horse, wearing a ridiculous outfit, a flat hat with 3 ostrich feathers, a gold and silver embroidered robe with puffed shoulders, and 3 silk sashes wrapped diagonally across his body in yellow, blue, and green. It looked absurd to me, but this was how medieval nobles showed off their wealth. The attendant's eyes lit up. He ran to the count and explained our situation, asking for guidance. Count Dedi squinted at us, recognized our family crest, and his face turned scarlet. "Arrest these frauds," he screamed, waving his riding whip. The attendant ordered the castle guards to surround us. Father protested fiercely that we truly were Sir Aber's guests. The attendant sneered. I knew he was lying about not recognizing our crest. Every court attendant was trained to identify every noble house in the empire. He was simply choosing to humiliate us to please the count. Father's hand went to his sword. Being called an impostor was worse than death for a man who had bled for the old duke. Eve was about to explode. I tried to stay calm, but felt my own rage building. Then a voice rang out from inside the castle gate. "What is happening here?" "Everyone stop!" Sir Aber strode out with General Relf at his side. The attendant scurried over to boast about catching intruders. Sir Aber took one look at us surrounded by guards, glanced at Count Dedi on his horse, and understood everything instantly. Without warning, he punched the attendant square in the face. The man crashed to the ground, spitting blood and a tooth. Sir Aber stood over him and roared that the Wendell family were his personal guests, and anyone who dared obstruct them was asking to die. The message was clearly aimed at Count Dedi as much as the attendant. The count's brow twitched, but he said nothing. Sir Aber personally escorted us through the gate. Father walked past the groveling attendant with cold dignity. Eve stopped, turned around, and made his most terrifying face. The attendant, who had just started to stand, fell right back down. Eve roared with laughter and followed Father inside. I was the last to pass. I stopped in front of the attendant, pointed at the roaring lion on my chest, and spoke in a steady voice. "One day, you will remember this crest. No, every lord in all of Europe will remember it." The attendant stared at the lion, trembling, unable to look away. We passed through 3 layers of walls to reach the main tower. Each ring was more heavily guarded than the last. Stone walls covered in ancient green moss, sentries with broad-bladed axes, arrow slits in every tower. Eve kept asking how many walls there were, his mouth hanging open. The main tower was a massive square stone column, 4 stories tall. The oak doors were bound with black iron bars and rows of iron studs. Sir Aber's family crest flew proudly from above. "This is my home," Sir Aber said with a proud sweep of his arm. "Welcome, my friends." Inside, the ground floor was an enormous hall with a vaulted ceiling. Stone pillars held everything up. Wooden walkways and staircases connected the upper levels, where nobles leaned against railings and chatted by windows. Long tables covered in white linen cloths filled the main floor, loaded with food and lit by candelabras. Father told me the open design was deliberate. Whispers echoed and carried, so the duke sitting at the head could supposedly overhear conspiracies. Of course, real plotters met elsewhere. Sir Aber led us to the far end of the table where an old man sat wearing a golden crown. Silver-white hair, piercing eyes, a hooked nose, thin lips that pressed together thoughtfully. This was the Duke of Mason himself. He wore a blue silk robe with a massive ruby pendant. Father dropped to one knee immediately, hand on his chest, reciting his oath of loyalty as a knight granted title by the old duke. Eve and I knelt too. The duke barely raised a bony finger in acknowledgement. Sir Aber frowned and told his father these were his guests. The duke glanced at his son with an amused, dismissive smile and said he had already been generous enough by not sending us to eat with the stable hands. This banquet had serious political purposes. Every guest was chosen for the power they could bring to the Hermann family. A nobody knight and his sons were irrelevant. Father quickly assured the duke we were grateful and had no other expectations. The duke nodded, turned to the Archbishop of Rist beside him, and never looked at us again. My blood boiled. Father and Eve accepted this naturally. They had grown up inside this rigid class system. But my soul came from a world without lords and peasants. Where I came from, every person had worth. Being treated like dirt because of birth made me want to flip that table over. But I swallowed my pride. One moment of temper could destroy everything my family had built. Eve had no such troubles. He found an empty seat, grabbed roast goose and wine, and started feasting. His blunt, cheerful manner actually attracted a few young nobles who struck up friendly conversation. I told father I needed some air. He nodded and said there was a side door to the left that led to a courtyard garden. He reminded me to bow and step aside if I encountered any of the Duke's family members. I figured they were all at the banquet. As I walked toward the side door, I overheard the Duke asking Sir Aber about his sister Josie. She had skipped the banquet, saying she felt dizzy, probably from playing too long in the courtyard the night before. The Duke was worried and ordered Sir Aber to go check on her personally. Sir Aber reluctantly left his plate of delicious food and headed off. I slipped through the side door into the cool night air, grateful to escape the suffocating atmosphere of wealth and power inside. Eve had challenged Count Dedi to a duel in a moment of rage. But the Count sat calmly in his chair, eating grapes, and smiled his sly little smile. He accepted, then immediately named one of his household knights to fight in his place. Eve was stunned. He wanted to face the Count man-to-man, but the law allowed high nobles to use substitutes in duels. "I'm very busy," the Count said with theatrical flair, waving his feathered hat. "Busy destroying these delicious dishes. But I have 100 knights with nothing to do. I should give them some exercise." The hall erupted in laughter. Eve couldn't fight 100 knights. That was the whole point. Low nobles could never truly challenge high nobles because the powerful always had endless replacements. Some lords even made sport of it, wearing their challengers down with wave after wave of fresh knights before stepping in to finish the job themselves. All perfectly legal. Eve stood there shaking with humiliation, the laughter ringing in his ears. I couldn't watch anymore. I pushed through the crowd and bowed deeply to the Count. I told him my brother had simply drunk too much wine and asked him to drop the matter. I apologized for the rudeness. It killed me to bow to this man, but I knew if things continued, Eve would die, either cut down by the Count's knights or crippled and executed by the Count himself. The Count refused. He said the challenge had been made and accepted in front of witnesses. Father rushed to the Duke's table and knelt, begging him to stop the duel. The Duke sat expressionless, calculating. Offending his powerful nephew over a nobody knight made no sense. Then Sir Aber leaned down and whispered in his father's ear, "They are my friends." That single sentence changed everything. The Duke raised his hand. The hall fell silent, so quiet you could hear a pin drop. He called Count Dedi by his family name and told him to end this farce. He had important business to discuss with him later. The Count bowed immediately and dropped the matter. The watching nobles drifted back to their food, whispering and wondering what connection our unknown family had to the Duke's house. We had no appetite left. We said goodbye to the Duke and headed for the door. Sir Aber followed us to the steps outside, apologizing for the disaster his invitation had caused. Father's voice was heavy with sadness. He had spent his whole life proudly serving the Hermann family, only to learn he meant nothing to the current Duke. It shook him deeply. Sir Aber sighed and said the debt belonged to the Hermann family, not to us. Then Eve did something no one expected. He drew his sword. General Relf grabbed his own hilt, thinking Eve had snapped. But Eve dropped to one knee, held his sword out on both palms, and spoke in a clear, strong voice. "I, Eve, heir of Black Swamp, swear before God to offer my sword and my life to you, Sir Aber. I will be faithful until death. If I break this oath, may my soul find no peace and my body no rest." Sir Aber was shocked. Then I understood what my brother had grasped instinctively. We had made an enemy of the most powerful count in the region. Our only hope was to bind ourselves to the one person who had shown us true kindness. I drew my sword and knelt beside Eve, making the same oath. Father looked at his sons, then at Sir Aber. He realized this young man cared more about honor and loyalty than the Duke himself did. He drew his own sword and pledged his service too. Sir Aber hesitated. Knights who were supposed to serve his father were swearing allegiance to him instead. An awkward situation. General Relf eased the tension by pointing out that serving the Duke's heir was the same as serving the Duke. The Twin Riders' battlefield fame only made this a good thing. Sir Aber accepted. He took each of our swords in turn, tapped our backs lightly, and formally received our oaths of loyalty. There on the steps of the Duke's tower, under the night sky, the Wendell family found our new lord, and our future. The banquet was the signal that war was coming. The Duke had gathered his powerful vassals and quietly kept their families inside the castle as hostages, though everyone pretended it was an honor. Back at camp, restlessness was spreading. Soldiers drank too much and fought each other. Eve paced around in his chainmail, impatient. Father rode back from the castle and told us Sir Eber had been summoned to the tower. The Duke was likely making final battle plans. Sir Eber had ordered Father to prepare our equipment and said he would request that our unit be placed under his command. I sat in the tent keeping accounts on parchment with precious ink Sir Eber had given me. I tracked every barrel of cheap malt beer I had bought at the market and all our expenses, writing in Arabic numerals nobody here could read. Father glanced at my strange numbers, but didn't press. There were too many mysteries about me already, and I think he was afraid of what answers he might find. He just told me to keep my writings hidden. Inside the tower's secret war room, behind locked doors guarded by armored knights, the Duke met with his inner circle, Sir Eber, Count Dedi, and 3 lords. On the table lay a sheepskin map showing both territories, with carved wooden figures representing troops, 5 for Mason, 3 for Saxony. Mason had more men, but the Duke wasn't happy. Saxon warriors were fierce forest hunters used to blood, while most of his own infantry were soft farmers. Numbers alone wouldn't guarantee victory. The lords argued bitterly. Some wanted a direct strike at the Saxon capital. Others worried about feeding 5,000 men on the march. Count Dedi bickered with everyone. The Duke turned to Sir Eber and asked for his opinion. The room went silent. Sir Eber leaned forward, tapped the map where Saxon territory was covered in forests, and pointed out that heavy cavalry couldn't charge through dense woodland where the Saxons knew every trail. He proposed splitting the army into 3. The Duke's main force would pin the Saxon army in place at the border. 2 flanking forces would circle around and raid deep into Saxon territory. When the Saxon lords heard their homes were burning, their morale would collapse. Then all 3 forces would crush them together. The lords nodded eagerly. It was simple and solved the supply problem too. The flanking forces could forage off enemy land. The Duke allowed himself a rare smile. His son had real talent. Count Dedi couldn't resist a jab. He sneered that Sir Eber was good at planning but untested in actual battle. Sir Eber seized the opening perfectly. He asked his father to give him command of one of the flanking forces. The Duke refused at first, not wanting his heir in danger. But Sir Eber argued that if he didn't lead his own plan, no lord would ever respect him. The other nobles agreed. A young lion must learn to hunt on its own. They wanted to see if this heir could truly protect their interests. The Duke gave in. He announced the final order. Sir Eber would lead the left wing, Count Dedi the right wing, and the Duke himself would command the center with the remaining lords. They would make the Saxon Duke pay dearly. He swore it before God. As Sir Eber's sworn men, our family would march with the left wing. The real war was about to begin. The march order finally came. 5,000 men moved out under the Duke's banner, a river of colorful flags stretching across the countryside. Knights in chain mail led the way, followed by their sword-bearing squires, then men-at-arms in mismatched armor, then poor knights serving as heavy infantry, and finally masses of peasant soldiers, carrying pitchforks and farm tools with blank, resigned faces. Strangest of all was the army that followed behind the army, a chaotic mob of camp followers, prostitutes, and slave traders. They shouted and cursed and fought among themselves while the military column ahead marched in silence. The nobles treated this like the most normal thing in the world. Our progress was painfully slow. We stopped 3 times on the first day alone. I couldn't blame the Duke. This wasn't one unified force but a patchwork alliance of vassals who had never trained together and sometimes barely spoke the same dialect. Without constant halts to reorganize, half the army would have wandered off before we even saw the enemy. Eve rode confidently, saying our numbers guaranteed victory. Father removed his helmet and warned us not to underestimate the Saxon Duke. He had fought against Saxons in the old Duke's time and knew them well. The Saxon Duke was a cunning old lion who got more dangerous with age, and his 5 great lords were all fierce warriors. Meanwhile, across the forest, the Saxon Duke stood on a rocky outcrop watching crows gather in the treetops. He was silver-haired but built like a young fighter. Beside him stood Count Berenger, a sharp and capable nobleman, and the Countess Wultefeld, a female knight in fitted chain mail with a purple cloak, descended from Viking blood. Her heavy axe infantry were enormous Norsemen who loved combat. The Saxon lords debated strategy. They had only 3,000 men against our 5,000, but their soldiers were hardened hunters and woodsmen, not soft farmers. They chose to dig into the dense forest near Göttingen Castle, where our cavalry couldn't charge, and their archers and heavy infantry would have every advantage. Back on our side, Sir Eber's plan unfolded exactly as he had proposed. Our scouts confirmed the Saxons were camped in the forest. They had even hung captured mason banners upside down from the trees to taunt us. The Duke smiled grimly. Now was the time to split. Sir Eber's left wing quietly separated from the main column, flags furled and hidden to avoid detection. Count Dedi's right wing departed at the same time. Both flanking forces slipped around the main battlefield. Sir Eber's target was Cleve, which meant passing through neutral Lower Lorraine territory, already arranged diplomatically. The Duke would hold the center and keep the Saxon army pinned, while the two wings circled behind to raid Saxon lands. When the Saxon lords learned their homes were burning, their will to fight would crumble. Then all three forces would close the trap. As Sir Eber's sworn men, our family rode with the left wing. Everything was going according to plan, but in war, plans are just wishes written on paper. While Sir Eber's left wing, our group, quietly slipped away from the main army with flags furled, the Duke's center force settled into position facing the Saxon-held forest. The two armies were separated by dense woodland that looked exactly as terrifying as the histories described. The same kind of dark Germanic forest where ancient tribes had once slaughtered Roman legions. We heard reports from messengers as we marched. The news wasn't good. Over the first week, the Duke sent multiple scouting parties into the forest, and almost all were beaten back. Saxon warriors ambushed them with throwing axes and round shields, appearing from nowhere in the undergrowth. Even worse, the Saxons had Norse bishop warriors, hulking Northmen in chainmail wearing helmet-shaped mitres, carrying war hammers and pointed shields. These weren't praying monks. They smashed through our light infantry like hammers through eggshells, shrugging off arrows behind their shields. But the Duke wasn't trying to win these skirmishes. He was buying time for us, the flanking forces, to circle around. His plan was to keep the Saxons focused on the front, while Sir Eber's wing hit Cleve and Count Dedi's wing struck Braunschweig from behind. What worried me was the Saxon Duke himself. From everything Father told me, this old silver-haired warrior was no fool. He had spent a lifetime fighting and could smell a trap. Sure enough, the Saxon Duke noticed something was wrong. The Mason army had far more men, but wasn't committing to a real battle, just poking with small raids. That wasn't normal. On our side, the Duke's lords were starting to worry too. The skirmish losses stung, and morale was slipping. The Duke silenced anyone who mentioned the flanking plan aloud, warning that secrecy was everything. And then the Saxon Duke did something bold and terrifying. He disguised himself as an old knight, took the female Countess Wultefeld as a squire, and walked straight into the edges of our camp, right through the crowd of merchants and prostitutes that followed our army. He got close enough to study the Mason positions with his own eyes. A prostitute even tried to seduce the Countess, thinking she was a handsome young man. They declined politely and kept walking. The old fox was hunting for answers. If he figured out that half our army had disappeared, our entire plan would collapse, and Sir Eber's wing, with our family in it, would be marching straight into a counter-ambush. We didn't know it yet, but the Saxon Duke had already seen through our plan. That old fox had disguised himself and walked right into the edge of the Mason camp to study it personally. He stared at the positions for a long time, and then it clicked. The Mason army had far more troops than what he could see. The missing soldiers had to be circling around to hit his lands from behind. Without hesitation, he split his own army into three. He left only 1,000 men under the cautious Count Ulricide to hold the forest position, enough to defend but with orders to retreat into the castle if the Mason Duke launched a full attack. Then he personally led 1,000 soldiers racing toward Braunschweig and sent Count Berenger with another 1,000 toward Cleve, the exact same two targets our flanking forces were heading for. His commanders were confused by the sudden orders, but nobody questioned the old warrior. He had been right too many times. Meanwhile, Count Dedi's right wing had already reached Braunschweig. With most Saxon soldiers pulled away to the main front, the countryside was defenseless. The Count's troops tore through villages and scattered the few local militias that tried to resist. The wild boar brothers were unleashed on the population. Patsy crushed skulls with his mace. Ogden did unspeakable things to his victims, gouging eyes, toying with the dead. Grover directed the looting with cold efficiency, seizing supplies and capturing young women. But Count Dedi was making a critical mistake. Instead of pushing forward quickly to link up with Sir Eber as the Duke had ordered, he was taking his time pillaging every village he found. His household knight warned him that Sir Eber might reach the rendezvous first and claim all the glory. That finally got the Count moving, not out of duty, but jealousy. He whipped Grover across the face for wasting time and ordered his forces to march. The Saxon Duke was already racing toward them, and our wing under Sir Eber was still circling through neutral territory, unaware that the trap we had set was now being turned against us. We learned the terrible news later through messengers. Count Dedi's right wing had been smashed. The Saxon Duke had figured out the entire plan. While we were still making our way through neutral territory toward Cleve, the old fox had already split his army and raced to intercept both flanking forces. He reached Braunschweig just as Count Dedi was busy plundering villages instead of pushing forward. The local people of Braunschweig, farmers, tradesmen, minor gentry, had been devastated by the Count's looting. The wild boar brothers had committed unspeakable horrors in every village they touched. When the Saxon Duke arrived with reinforcements, the surviving locals rallied behind him, burning with revenge. Even ordinary peasants fought like demons. Count Dedi's household knights were skilled warriors. They rode through the infantry formations, cutting throats from horseback, using their war horses to bulldoze through foot soldiers. A young knight named Marvin challenged the Saxon Duke himself to single-mounted combat, a brave but fatal decision. The old Duke waited until the last moment to lower his lance, striking above Marvin's shield where the young knight couldn't adjust in time. Marvin was knocked from his horse with a broken lance through his neck. The other knights acknowledged it was a fair kill. Then the Saxon Duke led a full cavalry charge into the Count's remaining knights. 300 Saxon horsemen against the Count's 100. It was overwhelming. One by one, the Count's elite knights fell or were captured. The backbone of his military power, built over years and enormous expense, was destroyed in a single afternoon. Count Dedi wept as his surviving officers dragged him away. He had entered Braunschweig with a powerful army. He fled with barely 500 demoralized foot soldiers. He ordered the Wild Boar brothers to cover the retreat with their family troops and limped back toward the Duke of Mason's main camp. The right wing of our grand plan had collapsed completely, and the Saxon Duke wasn't done. He was now free to turn his attention toward Sir Eber's wing. Toward us. Word reached us piece by piece as we marched. The situation at the main front had changed dramatically. Count Dedi had fled all the way back to Weimar Castle and locked himself inside, hiding behind thick walls and a deep moat. He had lost most of his 100 household knights. Years of investment wiped out in one battle. The Wild Boar brothers were left behind as a rear guard and forgotten. When the Duke of Mason heard about the defeat, his fury was terrible. He couldn't understand how the Saxon Duke had seen through the plan. Suspicion of a traitor spread through the camp like poison. But the Duke was too experienced to waste time on witch hunts. He noticed something. The daily skirmishes from the Saxon side had grown weaker and less frequent. The enemy forest camp was running on fumes. He ordered a full assault. 3,000 men advanced through the forest in formation, cavalry, infantry, and archers in 3 columns. The sound of their march sent crows screaming into the sky. Saxon ambush parties hiding in the brush struck at the flanks, but were swallowed by the sheer numbers. The last Saxon fighter in the forest was pinned to the ground with a spear and had his throat cut. When the army cleared the trees, the Duke ordered his 300 archers forward. They planted arrows in the dirt, drew their short bows at 45 degrees, and released. The sky went dark with shafts raining down on the Saxon camp. Screams erupted inside. Men with arrows in their limbs rolled in agony. The Saxon camp collapsed almost instantly. Cavalry fled through the back gate. Infantry scrambled over their own defensive fences. The Duke watched without any joy. He understood. If the enemy broke this easily, there had never been a real force here. 1,000 men at most. The Saxons had been holding him in place with a skeleton garrison while their main army went hunting for his son. For me, the Duke's knights charged and slaughtered the fleeing Saxons without mercy. The camp fell in a single morning. The Duke pushed forward toward the nearby castle, but his mind was on one thing only: Sir Eber's safety. When his soldiers brought a captured young Saxon knight who begged for ransom, the Duke didn't even look at him. He raised his finger and drew a line across the air. Kill him. The knight was dragged to the edge of a grove, forced to his knees, and beheaded with one stroke. The Duke's rage was beyond reason now. Every Saxon was paying for the danger his son was in. And we, Sir Eber's left wing, with my family among them, were still marching toward Cleve, not yet knowing that the Saxon Duke had already sent 1,000 men under Count Berenger racing to meet us. Sir Eber's force marched fast toward Cleve. Looking at our army, I felt uneasy. Apart from 50 household knights in proper chainmail and helmets, most of our soldiers were untrained peasants with terrible weapons. Some didn't even have shirts on. Without General Relf keeping order, half of them would have deserted before seeing a single enemy. I rode my shaggy horse up to Sir Eber and suggested we have the light infantry cut sharpened wooden stakes as we marched. Marcus, the English mercenary, had told me about how archers in his homeland planted stakes in the ground to stop cavalry charges. I knew from history that this tactic would one day destroy the finest French knights, though it wouldn't be invented for another 100 years. I was gambling by introducing it early, but we needed every advantage. Sir Eber was curious and agreed. He ordered a halt to rest the troops and let the soldiers cut stakes from the forest. After swearing loyalty to him, Father had become one of his household knights, and I served as Sir Eber's personal squire. The knight asked me to distribute some of my malt beer to his knights. He'd pay double. The barrels I had bought cheap at the market were finally earning their keep. The knights cracked open the barrels with their swords and drank from their helmets, laughing in the heat. Then I did something that caused trouble. I ordered 2 more barrels opened and shared among the 900 foot soldiers. Each man got barely a mouthful, but the effect was immediate. Their dull eyes brightened, their backs straightened. They were amazed that someone would give them the same drink as the knights. Eve thought I was crazy for giving away our merchandise to peasants. But a group of angry knights gave me a much bigger problem. A knight named Stan marched up and demanded to know why I was giving noble men's drink to lowly soldiers. He said it was an insult to knightly blood. I told him I saw no difference between them. Everyone here carried weapons under Sir Eber's banner and fought in his name. Whether mounted or on foot, we were all the Lord's warriors. Unless, I added with a smile, Stan served someone else. Stan's face turned red. He couldn't say no without betraying his oath. He pointed a trembling finger at me, failed to find words, and stormed off. The watching soldiers looked at me with something I hadn't seen before: respect. I exhaled and told myself to stop provoking the privileged class. I always told myself that. I never listened. As I turned to check on the stake cutting, I spotted Eve lying under a tree behind me, sword at his side, sipping from his horn cup with a quiet smile. He had been there the whole time, ready to draw his blade if those knights had laid a hand on me. That warmth in my chest reminded me why this strange medieval life was worth fighting for. My soldiers sharpened dozens of wooden stakes while we rested. I had them cut both ends to points so they could be planted in rows, a wall that charging horses couldn't cross. The idea came from Marcus's homeland, where English archers would use these stakes to stop cavalry. Historically, this tactic wouldn't be invented for another century, but I needed it now. We loaded the stakes onto supply wagons and resumed marching. Sir Eber was anxious to reach Cleve quickly. None of us knew that at that very moment, Count Dedi's right wing was being destroyed by the Saxon Duke. The messenger the Duke of Mason sent to warn us missed our column entirely. We crossed a small river into Cleve County, a peaceful, prosperous land with windmills and monastery bells ringing in the distance. Farmers saw our army and fled screaming to their villages. The local castle sat on a cliff with 3 steep sides and 1 narrow mountain path, practically impossible to storm. Sir Eber ordered us to bypass it and keep pushing toward the Saxon army's rear at Göttingen. But the castle's garrison wasn't going to let us pass quietly. A force of several dozen knights charged out across the drawbridge, heading straight for our rear guard. Sir Eber asked who would deal with them. Knight Stan, the one I had embarrassed over the beer, saw his chance for revenge. He suggested sweetly that the silver-tongued squire should handle it with foot soldiers, since wasting elite knights on a few local horsemen would be foolish before the real battle. The other knights backed Stan up. Sir Aber had no choice. He ordered me to take 200 infantry and hold the Cleve Knights while the main force continued forward. He told me to retreat to the border hills if I couldn't hold, and that he'd wait for me there. Father and Eve rode over, worried. They couldn't speak up among the hostile household knights. Father told me to find ground where cavalry couldn't charge easily. I nodded and drew my sword. I requested one thing from the supply train, the wagons. I arranged them in a circle, end to end, creating a makeshift wagon fort. 200 soldiers with shields and spears filed inside. It was crude, but it would break up a cavalry charge. The Cleve Knights laughed at my little wagon ring. They lowered their lances and charged with a thundering war cry. I also had Marcus distribute my secret weapon, something I had ordered made back at the Mason camp, not knowing I would actually need it in battle. It was designed specifically to fight mounted knights. I stood near the center of the formation, watching the knights grow larger as they closed the distance. Their lances punched through the flimsy wagons, flipping them over. Warhorses leaped through the gaps. The knights threw away their broken lances, drew swords, and began cutting down into my infantry from above. The real fight was just beginning. The Cleve Knights crashed through my wagon circle and tore into my infantry. It was brutal to watch. Their swords cut through men who had no helmets or armor. My soldiers' spears and pitchforks bounced off chain mail without effect. The knights' warhorses kicked and trampled anyone who got close. These were trained killing machines. Every sword stroke was muscle memory from years of practice. My farmers were outclassed in every way. They were already afraid of knights just from a lifetime of bowing to them. Marcus ran up and said our men were getting exhausted while the knights only grew stronger. I watched another soldier fall with blood spraying like mist and made my decision. Use the secret weapon, I said. Marcus sprinted to our Wendell family soldiers and gave the order. They pulled out the multi-ball bolus, weighted ropes I had designed back at the Mason camp, inspired by South American hunting tools. They worked like the vine and stone weapon I had used against Eve in the forest, but better. Several weighted cords tied together, swung, and thrown at a target. The spinning weights would wrap around anything they hit. Against men standing on the ground, bolus were just a nuisance. Against men sitting high on horses, perfect targets sticking up above the crowd, they were devastating. The first bola hit Knight Cobert in the head with a crack that rang through his helmet, then wrapped around his neck. He toppled off his horse, dazed and tangled. More bolas flew. 5 or 6 knights were pulled from their saddles in seconds. The infantry swarmed the fallen riders, pinning them down and beating them through their armor. Even chain mail can't protect you from a mob pounding you with clubs. The surviving knight's leader, a veteran named Ban, screamed for everyone to dismount. Smart thinking. On foot, they'd be harder targets and could hide among the infantry. But climbing off a warhorse in full chain mail without a squire's help was clumsy and slow. Most knights were tackled while trying to dismount, falling like overturned turtles under piles of smelly farmers. Ban managed to get down cleanly and fought brilliantly with sword and shield, knocking soldiers away left and right. But he was surrounded and knew it. I called for everyone to stop. The knights caught their breath, grateful for the pause. Ban asked to speak with the commander. I stepped forward, a squire in leather armor with a cold-forged sword called Terminator at my hip, surrounded by servants swinging bolus. Ban complimented me on the fight, then proposed a deal. He offered single combat. If he won, his men went free. If I won, they all stayed as prisoners for ransom. Marcus told me not to accept. We had them completely surrounded. But I looked at my soldiers, bleeding, gasping, covered in dirt and other men's blood. They had given everything they had today. Asking them to keep fighting skilled knights in close quarters would cost more lives than I was willing to spend. I agreed. I told Ban to take a few minutes to rest first. The response stunned me. Every soldier in that wagon circle, my ragged peasant infantry and the Cleve Knights alike, raised their voices together. Long live Lord Arrod. The soldiers cheered because I had spared them more bloodshed. The knights cheered because I had shown true chivalry by letting Ban rest before we fought. It was the strangest, most moving moment of my new life. Enemies and allies united in respect for a squire from a no-name family, standing in a circle of broken wagons in the middle of nowhere. Ban and I faced each other a few paces apart. We raised our swords in salute. He took the plow stance with sword and shield. I gripped Terminator, my cold-forged half-sword with its flame-shaped blade, and took the high ox guard. I struck first, driving down from above. Ban caught it on his shield with a heavy thud. He stepped forward, hiding behind his shield so I couldn't see his sword arm, then thrust at me from below. I shifted my feet, dropped my blade to low guard, and deflected his strike. Our swords touched and separated like lightning. The crowd went wild, knights and peasants alike. I almost laughed. We were supposed to be fighting a battle, and it had turned into a tournament with cheering spectators. Ban was experienced and powerful. He swung huge, heavy blows that nearly knocked me off balance. But his chainmail was slowing him down, while my light leather armor let me move freely. He was also distracted, worried that Sir Aber might send reinforcements back and make the whole duel pointless. I suggested he remove his heavy helmet. He did, and threw away his shield too. Now we were both fighting with two-handed grips. He hit harder without the shield weighing him down, and I had to work to keep dodging. But I could see the plan coming together. When the moment came, I was ready. Ban raised his sword for a big overhead chop. I dropped my weight, angled my crossguard upward at 45 degrees, and used a sliding counterstrike to redirect his blade past me. My sword tip traced a line across his cheek and came to rest against the artery on his bare neck. If he had been wearing his helmet, my attack would have been useless, but he had taken it off himself. The Cleve Knights went pale, wondering if I had planned this all along. Honestly, yes, I had. I've lost, Ban said quietly, feeling the cold steel against his throat. My soldiers erupted in cheers. Ban and his knights offered their swords in surrender, but I told them to keep their blades. I only wanted the ransom money. I thought I was being generous. Ban could hardly believe it. He quickly agreed and sent a rider to the castle. Soon 1,000 silver coins arrived as a guarantee, and the knights were released one by one after signing ransom notes stamped with their family seals. They rode away happily, with their swords, their armor, their horses, everything. I watched them go, feeling pleased with myself. Then I turned to Marcus and asked why the knights had taken all their equipment. Marcus stared at me. "You didn't take their swords," he said slowly. "That means it was an honor battle. They keep everything. If I had accepted their swords, I would have gotten their horses, their armor, their weapons, everything worth real money. By letting them keep their blades, I had accidentally declared the whole thing a gentleman's contest where the loser walks away with his dignity and his gear intact." "Are you kidding me?" I screamed. In the distance, the Cleve Knights heard my shriek. They collectively dug their golden spurs into their horses and galloped away at full speed, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust. I had been outsmarted by medieval etiquette. The great time traveler with 1,000 years of knowledge, tricked by a set of rules I never bothered to learn. Marcus just shrugged. At least I had the written ransom notes. But the lesson burned. In this world, what you don't know about customs can cost you more than any battle. Back at camp, Eve laughed so hard he cried when he heard I had let the Cleve Knights keep all their equipment. I sat on a beer barrel, miserable. Father came out of the tent and said the loss was real, but defeating knights with peasants had made a powerful impression on Sir Aber, and that was worth more than a few horses and suits of armor. That evening, Sir Aber's squire came to fetch me. The knight wanted to see me personally. Eve watched me go and said quietly that I was going to rise high. Father put a hand on his shoulder and reminded him that I was family, and family supports each other. Sir Aber's camp was impressive. 50 knights' tents surrounding his large central pavilion, colorful pennants flying, meat cooking over campfires. Inside the tent, Sir Aber had changed into a white linen shirt, a ruby-studded silver cross around his neck. He poured me malt beer, not his preferred Burgundy wine, but good enough for wartime. He congratulated me warmly. Everyone expected the Cleve Knights to capture me easily. He had already planned to pay my ransom out of his own pocket. Instead, I had beaten them with farmers. He promised that after defeating the Saxon Duke, he would have his father knight me personally. I told him it was mostly luck and that I wouldn't try it again. The cavalry charge had been terrifying. Without the wagon circle, one pass would have killed a third of my men. I needed longer spears, like the ones the Scots and Swiss would eventually use. Sir Aber gently scolded me for releasing the knights, without consulting him first. He wasn't angry, just reminding me that we were deep in enemy territory and needed to be careful. I apologized and admitted I still had much to learn about politics. He smiled and said we were almost at the Cleve border. He wondered what the Saxon Duke's face would look like when he discovered two armies behind him. Then shouts and clashing metal erupted outside. We grabbed our weapons and rushed out. The household knights were facing off against riders at the edge of camp. Knight Stan reported it was Cleve cavalry, apparently back for revenge. Sir Aber glanced at me. My face burned red. I had just released these men hours ago, and they were already attacking? But they weren't attacking. They kept approaching and retreating, refusing to fight, calling out one name, mine. I pushed through the crowd, raised a torch so they could see my face, and asked what they wanted. A Cleve rider delivered a message from Ban. The force that attacked Braunschweig has been destroyed. The Saxon Duke's army is hunting for you right now. They will find you soon. This warning is Ban's repayment for the mercy you showed us. Leave immediately, as fast as you can. Then they turned their horses and galloped back toward their castle, vanishing into the darkness. We stood frozen. If this was a trick, we could ignore it and keep marching. But if it was true, our entire flanking plan had collapsed, and 1,000 Saxon warriors were closing in on us right now. My decision to spare those Cleve knights and let them keep their honor, the same decision everyone had laughed at, had just saved all our lives. The mercy I showed Ban had come back as the most valuable thing in war: information. The Cleve Knights' warning split Sir Aber's camp in two. He called all the knights into his tent, but instead of clarity, the meeting turned into a shouting match. Stan and his allies insisted the Cleve men were lying, a trick to scare us into retreating. The older, more cautious knights argued that if the warning was real, we'd be marching straight into a trap. Sir Aber sat behind his table, torn. His pride wanted to push forward. Admitting the plan had failed would devastate his reputation. But his reason told him he held 1,000 lives in his hands with no hope of rescue if things went wrong. He turned to General Relf for advice. The old Danish warrior did something unexpected. He pointed at me. This message came through Arrod's contacts. Why not hear what he thinks? Sir Aber's eyes lit up, and he called me in. Stan immediately protested that a mere squire had no business in a knight's council. Father stepped forward and said a wise leader listens to all voices. Eve loomed over Stan until the knight backed up a step. Sir Aber waved Stan down. I bowed and gave my answer. It didn't matter whether the message was true or false. We should simply stop and wait a few days. If enemy pursuers appeared, we'd know the warning was real and could prepare our defense on ground of our choosing. If nobody came, we'd resume the march after a good rest. Either way, stopping was safer than being ambushed on the road. The tent went quiet. Even Stan couldn't argue with that logic. Sir Aber nodded but raised a practical problem. We were running low on food. The supply officer said our rations might not last until Göttingen. Stan suggested raiding nearby villages, but I stopped him immediately. We were deep in enemy territory. The local people were neutral for now. If we started burning and stealing, we'd turn every farmer into a scout for the Saxons. We didn't know the terrain, they did. Making enemies of the locals could be fatal. Sir Aber agreed, but soldiers needed to eat. I told him something I had learned from chatting with the captured Cleve knights. There was a river nearby, full of fish and freshwater mussels. We could move camp to the riverbank and feed the army from the water. Can you eat mussels? Sir Aber asked, genuinely puzzled. I almost laughed. These Europeans threw away perfectly good organ meats and had no idea that shellfish was food. Back in China, people would eat anything. Nothing went to waste. I told him to trust me. We relocated to the river. I dug a mussel from the sandy mud, tossed it into the campfire until it popped open, and handed it to Sir Aber. He took a cautious bite, and his face transformed with delight. He became the first medieval nobleman to eat a freshwater mussel. I found river crabs too and boiled them in a pot. The whole camp was soon feasting on food they had walked past their entire lives without knowing it was edible. Sir Aber licked his fingers clean and grinned at me. You really are a miracle worker, he said. I shrugged and ate my own mussel. In a world without pollution, they tasted fresh and sweet, a little fishy, but honestly better than the rock-hard bread and mystery porridge I had been choking down for months. The Cleve warning proved true. Within days, a Saxon scouting party spotted our camp by the river and sent up a smoke signal. burning horse dung that rose in a thick black column. We saw it. They saw us. The hunt was on. Count Beringer arrived with his full force. He was a wealthy lord from Hamburg. His soldiers were city guild apprentices and craftsmen, far better equipped than ordinary farmers. They wore leather armor or padded coats, and carried real iron weapons. Behind them rode 300 household knights in gleaming chain mail. This was a serious army, but I had spent those precious waiting days well. The river and swamp formed natural barriers on two sides. On the open approaches, I had the soldiers dig a maze of shallow trenches and plant rows of sharpened stakes. The trenches ran at angles, some parallel to our line and some perpendicular, creating channels that would force attackers to bunch up and slow down. Between the trenches, I left narrow paths, not by accident, but as killing zones where our archers and spearmen could focus their fire. When Sir Aber's knights saw the enemy banners, tension filled the command tent. I told them to stay calm. With the river, swamp, stakes, and trenches, our camp was essentially a natural fortress. Defending a fortress required the enemy to bring 10 times our numbers. Beringer didn't have that. Stan sneered that my trenches were useless. Enemies would simply walk between them on the paths I had left open. General Relf shut him down. He had been studying my design for days and understood it perfectly. The staggered trenches would stretch and thin any attacking force. By the time enemies reached our inner positions, they would arrive exhausted, disorganized, and in small groups. Relf asked where I had learned this. I panicked for a moment, then claimed I had once read a Roman military manual that my family owned, tragically lost when it fell into a fireplace. I looked at Father desperately. He paused, then nodded and confirmed the story. Sir Aber nearly leaped out of his chair. A Roman military text was priceless, the holy grail of medieval warfare. When I said it was burned, his face went white with disappointment. But then hope returned. If I had learned these methods from Roman wisdom, then even the Saxon Duke himself couldn't break through our defenses. The mood in the tent transformed. Knights who had been terrified now stood tall with confidence. Then the horn sounded. Beringer's army appeared across the river, banners flying, a great key on his family standard. Sir Aber recognized it immediately and was relieved it wasn't the Saxon Duke in person. But 300 elite knights and well-armed infantry were still a fearsome sight. Beringer studied our position through the slits of his dog-faced visor helmet. The trenches and stakes puzzled him. Then he spotted Sir Aber's personal banner, the Mason Duke's crest with a white railing above it, marking the firstborn heir. His eyes lit up. Capturing the Duke's son would be the prize of a lifetime. His deputy suggested using archers to soften us up. Beringer refused. He wanted Sir Aber taken alive. Stray arrows might kill his prize. He ordered his infantry forward instead, straight into my maze of trenches and stakes. The battle for our river camp was about to begin. I stood behind the third defensive line in my leather armor, Terminator at my hip, 5 family servants beside me armed with slingshots and bolas. Father and Eve left to defend Sir Aber's central position, leaving me in charge of my section. The horns sounded and Beringer's infantry charged. They were city militia from Hamburg, better armed and armored than ordinary farmers, wearing leather and padded coats with real iron weapons. But my trench system worked exactly as designed. The rows of stakes and ditches split their attack into smaller streams. Men naturally avoided the obstacles and funneled into the gaps, where our archers and stone throwers were waiting. My soldiers pelted them with slingshot stones and river pebbles. Even the regular infantry started copying us, grabbing handfuls of smooth stones from the riverbank. Arrows and rocks rained down on the militia from behind the stakes. When groups stumbled into the narrow channels between the trench lines, our spearmen jabbed through the gaps in the wooden stakes. The militia couldn't form up for a proper assault. They just kept getting chewed apart in small pieces. Beringer lost patience. He sent in 50 dismounted knights, fully armored in chain mail with plate on their elbows and knees, carrying swords and pointed shields. These were the real thing. A young knight named Hayden walked steadily toward our lines. Arrows bounced off his polished helmet. Stones hit him 30 times. He barely flinched. When he reached the first stake line, a terrified peasant soldier charged him with a spear. Hayden sidestepped, smashed the man down with his shield, and drove his sword through the fallen soldier's back. The peasant twitched once and went still. He hadn't even scratched the knight's finger. One by one, the armored knights pushed through every defense. My light infantry couldn't hurt them. Spears and pitchforks bounced off chain mail like toys. The peasants retreated in fear. The knights advanced slowly but unstoppably toward my command position. But I had planned for this. All the paths through my trench maze converged into a single narrow corridor leading to the main camp. The knights filed in, pressing closer together as the walls of stakes squeezed them tight. They grumbled about the cramped space, but kept pushing forward. Hayden was sharper than the rest. He stopped. Something felt wrong underfoot. No wet sand, but dry earth. He kicked the ground and found dry straw hidden beneath thin dirt. The smell of alcohol hit his nose. Horse-feeding straw soaked in malt beer, buried under a layer of soil along the entire corridor. He looked up and saw what was waiting at the end of the path. A line of our archers stood at the camp gate, arrows wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. A knight held a torch and lit them. The arrow tips burst into flame. Hayden's heart nearly exploded. He spun around and screamed at his comrades to retreat. The enemy was going to burn them alive. The other knights laughed. This was a wet riverbank, they said. Nothing could catch fire here. They were wrong. The straw was dry. The beer was flammable, and they were standing right in the middle of it. The fire arrows hit the hidden straw, and it caught, but the flames were small, just as I expected. General Relf looked disappointed. He thought my trap was supposed to burn them. Who said fire is the only weapon? I replied. The real killer wasn't flame, it was smoke. I had learned in my old life that most fire victims die from inhaling smoke, not from burns. And this wasn't ordinary smoke. Days earlier, some soldiers had gotten sick eating colorful mushrooms from the forest. I investigated and found toxic mushrooms and belladonna growing nearby. I boiled the belladonna into a concentrated liquid and mixed it with whale oil that Sir Aber had given me. When the oil-soaked straw burned, it released poisonous fumes. The effect was devastating. The knights, trapped in the narrow corridor in their heavy armor, couldn't move fast enough to escape. The smoke wrapped around them. They started coughing violently, doubling over, dropping their swords and shields. One by one, 50 elite knights collapsed like drunk men, some giggling, some staring at nothing. I quickly told our soldiers to soak linen cloths in water and cover their mouths and noses. The smoke could hurt us too. Across the field, Count Berenger watched in horror as his unstoppable knights simply fell over. His deputy's face went white. Witchcraft, he stammered, crossing himself frantically. Even Berenger, who was smarter than most, couldn't explain what had happened. His remaining soldiers and knights began drawing crosses on their chests, staring at our position with pure terror. Medieval warriors feared no sword or lance, but dark magic was another matter entirely. Berenger ordered a halt and called for priests to bless his troops. The attack was over. We dragged the unconscious knights back to camp and tied them to posts. When Knight Hayden woke up, he was confused and furious. He had been hallucinating, floating through clouds, seeing beautiful angels with perfect bodies. Then someone dumped cold water on him, and he found himself tied up in his underwear, surrounded by barefoot peasants. He screamed about witchcraft and demanded God's forgiveness for our sins. I told him it was just poisonous mushrooms, not magic. He didn't believe me. I counted our prisoners, 50 knights plus a number of city militia, and headed to Sir Aber's tent to report. The retreat horns were already sounding from Berenger's camp. We had won. But when I pushed through the tent flap, the buzzing conversation inside died instantly. Every knight in the tent stared at me. Some stepped backward as I approached, as if I carried the plague. General Relf had called my methods unkightly. The knights had watched me defeat their counterparts with trenches, bolus, and poison smoke, not with sword and honor, but with tricks and toxins. I had won the battle, but I was starting to realize that in this world, how you win matters almost as much as whether you win at all. When I entered the tent, every knight stared at me like I was carrying the plague. I understood immediately. They thought I had used witchcraft. Sir Aber handled it perfectly. He asked me directly whether I had used evil sorcery or a legitimate military tactic, giving me room to explain. I said it was entirely from the ancient Roman military manual my family once owned. Just a battlefield technique using smoke and natural plants. Nothing to do with magic. The Wendell family were baptized Christians, I reminded them. How could we possibly practice witchcraft? The knights relaxed instantly. Of course, the Romans would know such things. They murmured, shaking their heads sadly about my family's burned book. Sir Aber smiled and told me to warn everyone next time so I didn't scare my own side. Stan muttered that it was still crooked tricks, but nobody listened. With the immediate crisis settled, Sir Aber kept me and General Relf behind to discuss our real problem. Beringer had pulled back, but positioned his army across our only exit. He was besieging us. If we sat here waiting, the Saxon Duke's main army would eventually arrive and crush us. I asked why we didn't use crossbows. They could pierce chainmail easily and would neutralize the knight's armor advantage. Sir Aber smiled bitterly. The Roman Pope had banned crossbows between Christians, especially against knights. Relf leaned in and whispered the real reason. They simply didn't have the engineering plans to build powerful crossbows. The Duke had sent people to buy designs from Italian city-states, but the Italians refused to sell. This was a state secret, Relf warned me. I filed that away silently. I could draw crossbow blueprints from memory, but after the witchcraft scare, revealing another impossible skill right now would destroy me. Better to wait until we returned to Mason territory, draw the plans on parchment, and claim I stole them from an Italian workshop. I could even sell them for good money. Sir Aber concluded we would have to organize a cavalry breakout through Beringer's lines. I warned that Beringer was a careful commander. He would expect exactly that. A frontal charge into a prepared defense could cost us dearly. We sat thinking late into the night without finding an answer. Outside, the battlefield fell into an eerie quiet. Beringer's people came searching for their dead and wounded among our trenches and stakes. Old women turning over bodies, looking for sons who hadn't come back. Wounded men called weakly for water from the ditches. Both sides knew this ritual and left the searchers alone. Then suddenly our camp gates opened. A column of knights burst out into the darkness, riding hard through the paths between the stakes and trenches, heading straight toward Beringer's position. I hadn't ordered this. Sir Aber hadn't ordered this. Someone had launched an unauthorized attack into the night. We were still in the command tent debating what to do when a knight burst in with terrible news. Stan had taken several knights and launched an unauthorized night raid on Beringer's camp. Sir Aber was furious. Relf said maybe the surprise attack could actually break the deadlock. But I had a bad feeling. I asked Sir Aber what kind of commander Beringer was. He said the Saxon Duke's vassals called him the Wolf, one half of a famous pair, a lion and a wolf. My stomach sank. Wolves are cunning and patient. A commander like that would absolutely expect a night attack after losing the day's battle. Through a gap in the tent fabric, I could see the moonlit silhouettes of Stan's knights riding toward the enemy camp. They weren't even trying to hide, charging across open ground with the full moon behind them, screaming war cries. Pure knightly pride with no tactical sense. Stan's group smashed through the camp gate. The sentries barely reacted. They cut through tent fabric, rode to the center, and found nobody. The campfires were burning, but the soldiers sitting around them were straw dummies dressed in enemy uniforms. The camp was empty. It was a trap. Before Stan could react, arrows rained from the darkness. Volleys fell from every direction into the camp center where the knights were bunched together. Their armor deflected the shafts, but their horses weren't so lucky. Animals screamed as arrows studded their unprotected bodies, bucking and throwing riders. One arrow found the gap between Stan's chain mail and leg armor, driving deep into his thigh. He screamed and dropped his shield, slumping forward on his horse. His companions grabbed his horse's reins and tried to reach the gate. But when they got there, hundreds of torches appeared in a ring around the exit. Beringer sat calmly on horseback behind a wall of 100 knights, his family banner flying high behind him. The wolf had let the prey walk into his den, then closed the door. Stan's reckless raid had failed completely, exactly as I feared. Now we had lost several of our best knights, and Beringer's position was stronger than ever. I stood in our camp staring into the darkness, listening to distant shouting and the clash of metal. Stan had wanted glory to outshine me. Instead, he had handed our enemy a gift,